Chapter 1321. At this moment, Kothenberg had finally transformed into a real grade 4 life form. His 400-meter-tall body, his rock-like skin covered in dark red veins, and his arms and legs that were as thick as mountains. Even though his body had shrunk, his control over his body was completely different from before. The Thunder Dragon arms had an unparalleled battle sense and danger perception, so it was the first to notice the difference in Kothenberg. Its azure dragon wings flapped rapidly in the air as it circled around the stone giant, quietly increasing the distance between them. However, the goose-like magical golem dragon did not have such keen senses, and it still recklessly charged forward. The two magic cannons on its back continuously fired energy fireballs the size of millstones, as if they were injected with chicken blood. The energy fireballs struck the stone giant's huge body, but the scene of stones raining down from the sky was no longer like before. Dark red patterns appeared on the surface of the stone giant's body, absorbing nearly half of the energy fireball's damage. The rest of the explosive energy only blew up some scattered rock fragments and did not cause much damage to the stone giant. The stone giant did not move an inch, and it suddenly opened its right hand facing the magical golem dragon. In the next second, a sandstorm engulfed the area where the magical golem dragon was. Before the magical golem dragon could escape, earth spears that resembled spears and swords shot out of the ground, stabbing the metal shell beneath it and causing it to make cracking noises. In just one attack, numerous dense and shallow pits appeared on the surface of the magical golem dragon's body. Go to hell! Frid's hoarse roar came from the stone giant's body. Then, the stone giant opened its hand and swung it at the magical golem dragon. They were at least 3 miles away from each other. The earth trembled, and an astonishing amount of earth elements gushed out of the soil, forming a huge hand with a circumference of 100 meters and slammed it down on the magical golem dragon. Although the magical golem dragon staggered due to the impact of the sandstorm and the earth spears, it still could not stand steadily. However, when it saw the terrifying power of the stone giant's attack, it still showed no signs of fear. It raised its metal-forged dragon head high, opened its mouth wide, and shot out a formless sound wave. The magic cannons on his back also increased the firing rate to the extreme. Energy fireballs connected into a dense line of fire, bombarding the giant hand that was coming at him. Dong! The soundwave, shockwave, and the magic cannons worked together and finally broke the earth in hand. The earth elemental hand finally crumbled, turning into an overwhelming wave of mud that pushed the magical puppet dragon more than 30 meters away. In the end, the demonic puppet dragon managed to stop itself from retreating by stabbing its metal limbs deep into the soil, creating a terrifying trench on the ground. The puppet dragon twisted its body and shook off the dirt on its body. It stared at the strange guy with a completely different aura in the distance, and the energy aura on its body began to slowly increase. Although the magical golem dragon didn't suffer much damage from the previous attack, it was still able to withstand the attack. But in the eyes of the outsiders, it was sent flying by the stone giant with a casual blow. This was a great humiliation to the demonized goblins who controlled the golem dragons. The golem dragon opened its huge mouth and let out a deafening roar that shook the entire battlefield. Then, it shook its head and swayed its tail as it pounced toward the enemy. Armstrong, who was hovering in the sky, folded its wings and dove down, forcing the stone giant to take a defensive stance with its ferocious attacks. A metal dragon, a stone giant, and a pure-blooded dragon. The 3 strange creatures with completely different life forms clashed once again. Fred, who had completely fused with Kothrin Castle, could now control the enormous stone giant with ease. It stood firmly on the ground, accepting the continuous flow of energy from underground to maintain the massive energy requirements of its giant incarnation. Its every move carried a massive amount of earth elemental energy. It would condense into stone balls and smash at its opponent, or transform into stone spears to launch terrifying piercing attacks, or form an earth-shattering meteor shower that would overturn a large area, With the help of Cothran Castle's mystical amplification effect, Fred's control and manipulation of the Earth elemental energy was getting more and more skillful and terrifying. With its rock-like body that was as hard as steel, the Thunder Dragon's lightning breath, the magical Golem Dragon's brutal charge, and the floating warship's cannons could only damage its scales and claws. They could not penetrate its rock body that was close to 100 meters thick and damage its soul. Meanwhile, Fred was firmly entrenched at the edge of the deep pit, attacking from afar and at close range. Every time he attacked, he would cause chaos on the Crimson Army's side. The magical Golem Dragon's body was made of metal, so it might be able to withstand Fred's Earth elemental attacks. On the other hand, the Lightning Dragon arms and the floating warship were too weak in front of the stone giant. If they were hit by its attacks, the consequences would be unimaginable. Two of the floating warships had already been pierced by Fred's spears, and they had no choice but to retreat from the main battlefield. If it wasn't for the fact that Fred's stone giant incarnation could not leave the deep pit too far, the Crimson Fleet would have suffered heavy casualties. The reason why the situation was so ugly was obviously related to the Crimson Fleet's advantageous position. In this battle, the Crimson Fleet seemed to have the upper hand, and the Intim family was completely defeated. From a bird's-eye view, a large area around Cothran Castle had already been conquered by the Magic Machine Legion. The opposing Magus troops were either annihilated or retreating. The sky and ground around the main battlefield were filled with figures chasing each other. Under such circumstances, the Lightning Lord Arms would not risk his life to fight the enemy. Once it was forced to restrain itself, the Tier 4 basic puppet dragon would encounter the living Kessling Castle, which was larger and more powerful than it. As if it had met its nemesis, it would be suppressed in every way it could, and the battle would be extremely frustrating. Seeing this scene, Grimm, who had been quietly watching from the inside of the Viscero ship, laughed. He suddenly stood up from his tall armchair, and with a flash of flames, he appeared at the bow of the ship. He did not transform into a molten giant, nor did he cast any fire spells. Just by standing there silently, Fred, who was still in the middle of an intense battle, felt a chill run down his spine. His attacking stance was no longer as bold as before. Facing multiple high-level enemies, Fred was also mentally and physically exhausted. He had to focus at least 40% of his attention on the legendary fire wizard Grimm, 30% on the cunning lightning dragon arms, 20% on the annoying magical golem dragon, and 10% on the magical golem dragon. The remaining 10% was constantly monitoring the movements of the floating warships. He had no choice. On the entire battlefield, only these guys could deal enough damage to him. As for the attacks from the other ants, they couldn't even scratch his itch, let alone inflict any serious damage. However, no matter how careful Fred was, the legendary fire wizard Grimm seemed to be toying with him. The fire wizard stood on the metal warship's bow and sneered at Fred. He did not show any signs of taking action. Could it be that Grimm's injuries hadn't fully healed, and he was just putting up a show? Once this idea was born, it firmly entrenched itself in Fred's mind like a sinister viper. No matter how he attacked or defended, he would repeatedly ponder the possibility of this problem in his heart. Was it a trap or an opportunity? Fred had no way of finding out. His hatred for Grimm had reached its peak after losing 100 years of his life. If there was a chance to kill him, he wouldn't miss it. He wouldn't even hesitate to pay a certain price for it. Right now, Fred had nothing left to lose. After making up his mind, Fred finally began to move toward the flagship, Viscero, without batting an eyelid. When he arrived at the location of the attack, Fred didn't hesitate to give up on the Thunder Dragon and Puppet Dragon. His huge body shrunk and expanded, and he teleported 1,000 meters away. Fred roared as he looked at the Viscero airship that was now within his attack range. "Grimm, go to hell." With that, Fred, who was at full power, extracted a large amount of earth element from the ground, condensed them into terrifying elemental stone balls, and smashed them at Grimm, who was standing on the bow. In the blink of an eye, the giant airship that resembled a small silver mountain was wrapped up in a shocking amount of soil and rocks. Under Freud's remote control, they suddenly squeezed inwards, almost as though they were going to crush the airship. The Earth Elemental's unique sluggish power wrapped around Grimm's body in an instant. Caught off guard, if Grimm couldn't unleash the power of a super expert, he might really be injured by this move. Faced with his enemy's terrifying attack, Grimm didn't show the slightest hint of fear. Instead, he revealed a sinister smile. With the help of the AI chip, his opponent's sneaky approach and gathering Earth Elemental energy naturally couldn't escape his eyes. However, in order to end this battle as quickly as possible, Grimm could only cooperate with his enemy and put on a show. Seeing the terrifying stone mountain pressing towards him, Grimm sensed the earth-shattering aura of the earth element. He took out a strange water droplet-shaped item from his bosom and waved it outwards. In the next second, a similarly indomitable waterman suddenly condensed out of thin air. The waterman was at least 100 meters tall, and its entire body was light green. There were a few strange metal rings with complicated patterns on its wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. As soon as it condensed, it roared and unleashed a terrifying waterfall. An endless stream of elemental water surged out of thin air, converging into a huge, surging wave that met the stone mountain head-on. Water and earth, two completely different elemental energies, collided in the middle of the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, a terrifying power ripple swept through the heavens and earth. Everything that came into contact with the ripple was silently crushed into pieces before being swept away in all directions. Gusts of sandstorms and streams of violent torrents were like two poisonous snakes entangled with each other, cleansing the entire world clean and delightfully. The 5 airships raised their defensive barriers and were swept away like small dinghies amidst the raging winds and huge waves. As they collided with each other and crushed by the power ripples, the warships suffered varying degrees of damage. Water Soul Jade, that was a grade 4 item from the spirit world, and it contained the full power of Water Prophet Lorenz's attack. Although Lorenz wasn't at the pinnacle of grade 4, he was still a powerful grade 4 life form. Hence, Grimm used the Water Soul Jade's power to withstand Freud's violent attack, allowing him to successfully escape. Seeing that Freud's stone giant wanted to continue attacking, Grimm couldn't help but shake his head and smile bitterly. He pointed behind him. Freud turned around in shock and saw Mary's petite and exquisite body burrowing into the deep pit like an arrow. The moment she entered the pit, Mary still had the time to turn around and wave at Freud. Chapter 1322. No, the heart-wrenching roar lingered in the air, but could not stop the most terrifying scene from becoming a reality. Fred, who had completely fused with Kesslin Castle, was extremely powerful. To a certain extent, this terrifying stone giant's battle prowess was far above that of a golden titan. If it was not for the flaw of being unable to stay away from the ley line node, this fellow would definitely become the nightmare of all super powerhouses. Even though it was 1 against 2, fighting against both the Golem Dragon and the Thunder Dragon at the same time, the transformed Fred was not at too much of a disadvantage. He even suppressed the Golem Dragon for a while. However, a pseudo-super powerhouse that was forcefully enhanced by some taboo means could not become a real powerhouse. As long as it was targeted, any tiny flaw in the combat system, or rather a chronic disease that was born in the womb, would undoubtedly be exposed and cause the entire system to collapse. It was the same for the transformed Fred. At least for him, there were 2 chronic diseases that could never be remedied and reconciled. One was that he could not unleash his battle prowess without the ley line node, and the other was that driving such a huge life form would consume too much of the host's life energy. Any one of these 2 defects would be fatal if the enemy grasped it, let alone both of them. Therefore, not long after Mary entered the deep pit, the ground began to shake and tremble violently. The towering stone mountain that looked like the resurrection of an ancient giant also collapsed with a loud rumble. The massive steel rock that had lost the restraint of the earth elemental power crashed onto the ground like a collapsing mountain, setting off a mushroom-shaped dust pillar that was hundreds of meters high. Amid the flying dust, Fred's hoarse cries of pain could still be heard. It could not be helped. After fusing with Kesslin Castle, this terrifying stone giant's body had become Fred's torso. Now that the stone giant's energy had been sucked out, its entire body collapsed. Fred, who had fused with it, was no different from being skinned and having his bones pulled out. He was being tortured by 1,000 cuts. If not for the unparalleled mental toughness of a Grade 4 wizard, this would have been enough to make Fred's spirit collapse and turn him into a complete idiot. Even so, the impact of that moment of pain was unbearable for Fred. The entire battlefield was haunted by his terrifying cries. What scared him even more was that the alchemy life form, Kathleen, who was born through witchcraft, already had his own consciousness and wisdom. He actually took advantage of the time when he was mentally weak and began to crazily invade the control of his consciousness. His spiritual force, his consciousness, his witchcraft knowledge, his emotional memories. Everything had become a battlefield for both sides to fight to the death. Every single memory, every single emotion, every single comprehension. These things that used to belong to him in the past had actually become a shared property between both of them. Fred, who had the upper hand after the fusion, felt fear for the first time. He realized that the despicable Kesslin was not only invading his memories and emotions, he was also erasing his existence. If everything he had was taken away by the other party, then everything that the symbol Fred represented would cease to exist. A new life would appear in the world with his complete memories, emotions, and knowledge. Kesslin. No, you bastard, this is all my fault. A new war broke out under the collapsing stone mountain. The revitalized Kesslin Castle continued to squirm and struggle. All the doors and stone windows leading to the outside world had been closed. The originally stony walls and tunnels were suddenly covered with a layer of soft, fleshy membrane. It was full of wet, sticky, and strange alchemy solution, just like the large and small intestines of a living creature. The Intim family wizards who were originally guarding the various secret rooms and strongholds of Kesslin Castle suddenly realized in horror that they had been surrounded by this horrifying, fleshy membrane. And as soon as their bodies came into contact with the membrane, they would be stuck to it and slowly melt away. Every time a wizard melted, Kesslin could obtain everything from the other party. A huge amount of spiritual force, fragments of knowledge, emotional memories, and all kinds of comprehension of witchcraft. And those powerful Intim wizards naturally would not just stand there and wait to be captured. They took out their wands, magic wands, scrolls, and secret treasures, and began to attack this Kesslin Castle with all their might. For a moment, the already dilapidated Kesslin Castle was filled with the roar of witchcraft, and gorgeous fireworks of elemental explosions could be seen everywhere. But unfortunately, Kesslin, who had long wanted to devour everything, would not let them escape from his body. Powerful specially made wizard beasts surged out from the secret passages of the castle, taking advantage of the time when the wizards were imprisoned and unable to move, and launched a fierce attack on them. The war had almost entered a white-hot level almost from the beginning. Just a moment ago, the Intim wizards were still fighting bravely, fighting a bloody battle with the Crimson family. But the next moment, they were fighting even more fiercely, but the targets of the battle were their former comrades and teammates. No, to be precise, they were fighting before, but now they were fighting with their lives. In order to save their own lives, in order to preserve their memories and emotions, in order to preserve their former existence. They were really fighting with their lives. Many wizards even chose to self-destruct at the moment of defeat. They would rather have their bodies smashed into pieces and cease to exist than to let them fall into the hands of the enemy and become a toy that could be manipulated and manipulated at will. But unfortunately, their sacrifice was destined to be of no value. As early as the moment of defeat, the revitalized Kesslin Castle had already sealed itself. From then on, Kesslin Castle had become a completely enclosed small space. Any soul and consciousness that died in the battle here could not escape. They could only cower and hide, waiting for the moment to be devoured and digested to arrive. And in the most core secret room of Cothran Castle, the life-and-death battle between Cothran and Fred continued. Although Fred had little life left and could barely live for another 40 to 50 years, he still did not want to give up all of this, and he was even more unwilling to let everything that he had worked hard for nearly 1,000 years become a wedding dress for someone else. Two completely different spiritual consciousnesses of different natures and forms were entangled in the secret room, fighting for dominance of the consciousness of this powerful alchemy life after the fusion. If one side won, the other side could only sink into oblivion forever. Therefore, there was no peace, no coexistence, only victory and defeat, life and death. The sound of rubble falling and collapsing was heard. The rocks on top of the mountain of collapsed boulders were lifted up and pulled out, revealing the distorted and squeezed Cothran Castle below. But what was strange was that all the doors and windows of Cothran Castle had disappeared. There was only what looked like a 5-story castle, but there was not a single entrance to it. Dong, dong, dong. Countless light blue tractive lights hit the stone mountain, and the tens of thousands of broken rocks of different sizes instantly lost their gravity and began to slowly float. Broken steel rocks were thrown out, and finally, the Cothran Castle that was buried under the stone mountain slowly rose into the sky, exposing itself to thousands of curious and doubtful gazes. "Master, what's wrong with this castle? Do you need me to help you break it?" Arms, the Tier 4 Thunderlord, stared at the strange alchemy castle curiously with his huge dragon eyes, a little confused. Did that Fred fool himself into thinking that he could protect himself by sealing the castle? He was a Tier 4 sorcerer. Could he be that stupid? Arms thought to himself as he reached out with his sharp dragon claws to touch the alchemy castle. The sorcery aura coming from inside the castle made him feel a little uneasy, as if something terrible was happening inside. "Yeah, Grim, what's wrong with that Fred? Why is his soul aura getting weaker and weaker?" This time, it was Blood Queen Mary who had just emerged from the ground. She was covered in dirt and dust, and even her long, elegant hair was stained with a lot of dirt. However, her face was filled with excitement and joy, and her right hand was lightly tossing a colorless and strange stone. Every time the stone shook slightly, it would emit waves of extremely pure magical energy. Anyone who smelled it would be able to feel the abundance of magical energy. An energy orb that is about to transform into a world stone. Arms, who had always been a fan of rare treasures, immediately had his dragon eyes turn into the color of a golden gem. His huge nose moved closer to the stone and took a deep breath, and he roared in surprise. In the next moment, Arm stood up and screamed in a long, draconic voice, "Master, I want this stone." Grim, who was slowly descending from the Viscero, snorted in annoyance. "That's Mary's loot. Go talk to her if you want it. Don't get in my way of appraising this alchemy castle." As soon as Arm's gaze landed on Mary, she stated her conditions in the most beautiful and elegant voice. 5,000 pounds of dragon blood. Arm's expression changed drastically, and he immediately gave her a big middle finger. Ignoring Arm's and Mary's frolicking, Grim concentrated his energy in his eyes, and a strong blue light shot out from the depths of his pupils. He slowly scanned the interior of Kieran Castle. At first, he was shocked, then he shook his head and sighed. Finally, a cold, mocking smile appeared on Grim's face. "Teacher, is that Fred inside? Do you think we should attack?" Meryl, who was in her half-human, half-dragon form, slowly approached the battlefield and asked her teacher in a soft voice. Everything that had happened in the Grade 4 battlefield was too unimaginable for her. Up until now, she had no idea how the battle had started, how it had developed, or even how it had ended. The only thing she knew was that the greatest enemy of the Crimson Expedition was hiding in this strange castle before her. But her teacher's expression was too strange, and she could not make sense of it at all. Did they win or not? Were they going to continue fighting? Grimm shook his head and sighed again. Stupid Fred. He taught this alchemy life too much knowledge that it shouldn't have known, and he also gained too many abilities that it shouldn't have. Humph, serves him right to suffer the backlash. Chapter 1323. Once the news of the Intim family's destruction spread, the entire scattered tower forest was shaken. The central forces that had once colluded with Fred to suppress the Crimson family were all in a constant state of anxiety. They were afraid that they would wake up one day and see the Crimson fleet strutting around in their field of vision. What made them feel even more hopeless was that on the second day after the Intim family's destruction, the Fabris family announced that they would accept the Crimson family's leadership and willingly become their subsidiary. They also sent a large number of magi from their family to join the newly established Horton Academy. These sorcerers had all terminated their service contracts with the Fabris family before they came and joined the Horton Academy as independent sorcerers. This kind of blatant action completely showed the intentions of the rank for refinement magus, Fabris. Following the Fabris family, Sorceress Clara of the Rander family made a similar announcement and also selected a few magi from the family to join the Horton Academy as free members. This was not the end. Soon after, a third force also made their stand. This third force was the Molten City that everyone knew about. All these years, the Molten City had maintained a good relationship with the Crimson family. The resource trade agreement between the two had greatly benefited both parties. The Crimson family had obtained the irreplaceable Kalos alloy, while the Molten City had obtained an endless supply of high-grade dragon-grade materials. Both parties were willing to fight, and the other was willing to suffer. The relationship was unbreakable. Even though Fred had promised the city lord Alfred many benefits, he was unable to pull him into the war against the Crimson family. Now, the trend of the Crimson family unifying the central region was so obvious. The city lord Alfred, who had already assessed the situation, naturally knew what he should choose. Hence, while many Magus families were still hesitating and observing, the Molten City had already become the third subsidiary force that had officially pledged allegiance to the Crimson family. The world was about to change. In the past, only high-ranked magi with a keen sense of smell would be able to faintly sense this powerful force that was rapidly changing the central region. But now, as long as one was not blind or deaf, they would be able to feel a strong gust of wind blowing towards them. 3 large Magus families successively pledged allegiance to the Crimson family. This became the most obvious direction, completely showing the future development of the central continent. Crimson, Horton, these two terms had also become the hottest terms in the central region. As long as it was a place where sorcerers gathered, these two words would be the most debated and discussed topic. They had already become symbols of some mysterious color and power, representing the future direction of power of the central continent. However, there were 33 regions in the central continent, with more than a dozen rank 4 organizations and close to 1,000 low-ranked Magus families and small to medium-sized organizations. It was easier said than done to unify such a large and complicated region and establish an effective and large sorcerer organization. Putting everything else aside, there were many hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the many small and medium-sized Magus clans. If they were not careful, they could offend an old monster who had lived in the outer realm for thousands of years. For example, the Salubo family. The Salubo family had Feldenan City as their headquarters, occupying no more than 3 to 400 square kilometers of land and having less than 100 wizards in the family. Intermediate wizard families like this could be found everywhere in the central continent. They were nothing special at all. However, if the Crimson family wanted to flatten the headquarters of the Sarubo family, they would have to offend the remaining great Magus Sarubo. He was in the outer realm and could not return to the Magus world personally. However, if this great Magus was angered, he could cause trouble for Grimm and plot against the Crimson family's businesses in the outer realm. Even if Grimm could dominate the central continent, he would have to bear the risk of having his businesses in the outer realm destroyed. Moreover, with Grimm's speed of development, It was only a matter of time before he reached the outer realm. If these small and medium-sized magus families were all wiped out in one fell swoop, the day Grimm stepped out of the outer realm would be the day the enemies of the great magi would come knocking on his door. Even Grimm's heart palpitated at the thought of a group of great magi waiting in the outer realm to skin him alive. It was precisely because this kind of forceful annexation was undesirable that Grimm had no choice but to take a roundabout route and use the Horton Sorcerer Academy to seize control of the central continent. I won't use the Crimson family's method to annex you. Everyone will compete fairly and use the excellent teaching environment, abundant resources, and powerful teachers to absorb the talents of the central continent. This way, the Horton Sorcerer Academy would only grow stronger and stronger. The families left behind by the great magi would not be able to attract new blood and would not be able to expand on their own. This way, the great magi would not be able to blame Grimm. In short, the descendants of the great magi could die, but not at the hands of the Crimson family. It was because of this that Grimm gave up on the Crimson family and set up the Horton Sorcerer Academy. It couldn't be helped. He didn't want to become a street rat in the future and be stalked by those great wizards every day. To be honest, if it was not for the grade 6 Great Magus Salubo, the Salubo family that he had a conflict with in the past would have been uprooted long ago. Everything was also caused by the multiplication of cause and effect. On the surface, these Magus families with the support of great magi were a huge burden for the Crimson family to unify the central continent. They were all people that Grimm did not dare to touch. However, on the other hand, they could also be used as a resource for Grimm's connections. If those great wizards in the outer realms were willing to build a good relationship with Grimm, he wouldn't mind nurturing some of their bloodline descendants. If the other party pressured him too much, Grimm could completely destroy their bloodline and cut off their last connection with the sorcerer world. As for why the descendants of the great magi would gradually decline, this was a curse that had been difficult to break since ancient times in the sorcerer world. First, it was difficult to give birth. Those who were able to become great magi were all inhuman. They might still have traces of humanoid appearance, but if their chests and lungs were to be pried open, it would be almost impossible to find any life factors or organs similar to humans. The super magi had already walked too far on the path of transformation and mutation. Even the life essence of these monsters had already mutated into a strange existence. How could there be a human woman who could mate with them and give birth to a normal human child? Normal women, and even low-grade magi, could not withstand the life essence of the great magi. Once such life essence was implanted into their bodies, they would be killed in the shortest time possible. If a man and a woman who were great magi wanted to mate, the probability of giving birth to a normal human child was extremely low. Therefore, the descendants of the great magi in the sorcerer world were mostly the flesh and blood left behind in the early stages of their growth. After thousands of years of inheritance, the similarity between these descendants and the great magi's bloodline was so thin that it was difficult to distinguish them. Moreover, the more powerful the magic creature, the weaker the ability to give birth to normal descendants. Therefore, although they carried the title of the great magi's bloodline descendants, which sounded very glorious, in reality, most of them had already declined and withered. Even the great magi who passed down the bloodline might not be willing to acknowledge these low-grade life forms. Second, it was difficult to pass down the bloodline. Those who could become great magi were all once favored by the heavens and geniuses. The path they took was often not replicable. This was also the main reason why after a great magi was born in a magus family, the latter did not have an endless stream of successors. It was not that he did not want to, but he could not do it. The great magi themselves might have used some rare resources that were almost extinct or rare treasures that were hard to find to cross the threshold of the bloodline. As for these juniors, where could they find resources to let them walk on their own path? The appearance of every great magi gave the juniors a possibility to learn from, but it was only a reference. Very few successors could follow the successful examples of the others and step into the ranks of the great magi. One of the main reasons for this was that all great magi were very secretive about their abilities and methods of advancement and would not announce it to the public. They were worried that their enemies would use this information to launch targeted attacks, so they would hide the truly important and precious things in their personal development. Without these things, the information released by the great magi to the public would not be as safe, and it would be very misleading. If other people wanted to advance according to their methods, they would definitely suffer and lose their lives. For example, if Grimm could advance to grade 5 in the future, the greatest contribution would definitely be the divine fire orb. But where could he find a second divine fire bead for his disciple or successor? Therefore, when one reached grade 4, there was only a vague direction for their future development. There was no longer a fixed path that could be used as a reference and follow. Following the destruction of the Enchantment family, the situation in the central continent could be described as turbulent and turbulent. At this moment, everyone was forced to choose a side and pick a side. They could either join the ranks of the rebels and join forces to fight against the Crimson family, or bow their heads and admit the Crimson family's actual rule over the scattered towers. They were not willing to choose either of these two options. That was why, while the Crimson fleet was still hovering over the ruins of the House of Enchantment and its movements were unknown, many envoys from various factions of the scattered towers had already rushed there, eager to discuss matters of partnership with the ruler of the Crimson. Chapter 1324. The fire on the ground had yet to be completely extinguished. Wisps of black smoke lingered on the former battlefield. With Castle Kesselin as the center, there were no longer any human buildings that could maintain their original form within 100 miles. Even the lush green forest that could be seen everywhere had turned into scorched earth, with large black scorch marks marking the area under their rule. However, on this withered land that had lost all signs of life, Castle Kesselin was still standing silently. With just the naked eye, it was impossible to find any traces of damage or battle on this castle that was still in perfect condition. How could an ancient castle survive in the central area of the main battlefield that was filled with desolation and ruins? And according to everyone's understanding, this Kesselin castle had transformed into an indomitable berserk stone giant and had a fierce battle with the Crimson family. Even though they knew that there must be a secret behind this, after the battle, not a single core magus of the Enchantment family escaped. All of them had disappeared without a trace. This caused many of the onlookers to scratch their heads in confusion, and they felt a bone-chilling coldness from the bottom of their hearts. Could it be that the Crimson family had already reached such a height that not a single member of the Enchantment family, led by old Fred, could escape alive? This speculation made Milva and the other magi fearful, and even the momentum of contacting the Crimson family to resist had weakened. At this moment, the few central forces that had once firmly opposed the Crimson family had actually laid down their banners and stopped fighting. They were temporarily hiding from the limelight, not wanting to be targeted by the Crimson family and become the second Enchantment family. The reason why they had opposed the Crimson family before was naturally because they did not want to give up their power and status. However, if they were to oppose the Crimson family intensely, their souls would be destroyed and their family's legacy would be severed. Such a price was too cruel for grade 4 magi who had lived for thousands of years. Freedom was important, but if the price for freedom was their own lives, this was something that grade 4 magi could not accept. Compared to their lives, it was not so hard to accept being under Grimm and a subsidiary force of the Crimson family. In the past, they were used to being tigers in the middle of the continent, and their knowledge were undoubtedly a little off. They had never seen how terrifying a super expert was, so they thought that they could join forces and use their advantage in numbers to suppress the other party. The battle at Gravel Canyon and Curslin Castle had completely shattered their false arrogance and comfort, and had also made them fully realize the power of the super strong. Super powerhouses and Tier 4 magi were no longer the same species. They were at opposite ends of the food chain. One was the predator, while the other was the laughable prey. This understanding completely subverted the stereotype that they had formed in the past hundreds of years, and it also made them realize how shallow and childish they were. The reason the scattered tower forest had been able to survive for tens of thousands of years was not because the Tier 4 sorcerers had intimidated the three great sorcerer organizations. Rather, it was because the three great sorcerer organizations had reached a delicate balance. Now that the balance had been broken, every magus of the central continent had to think about the future direction of the scattered towers. Should he choose Grimm or one of the three great wizard organizations? Or perhaps it would turn into a huge quagmire, turning the central continent into a bloody battlefield for the three great magus organizations to fight? In the past, the Tier 4 Magi would instinctively reject the idea of unifying the central continent when they heard the words, unifying the central continent. Now, even they had to seriously consider this question. If they were unwilling to make a choice, there would always be someone who would force them to make a choice. When that time came, they would have much fewer choices left. Unknowingly, unifying the central continent had become a thing of the past. Now, most people were discussing how to unify the central continent. Whether Grimm was cruel or not, whether the Crimson family would take everything, and what position the Magus families would have in the central continent in the future. These thorny questions that needed to be solved became what the higher-ups of the families wanted to know and understand the most. Of course, the answers to these questions could only be obtained from the Crimson family. Thus, on the 11th day of the Inium family's destruction, which was also the second day that Molten City announced that they were siding with the Crimson family, a dense number of mysterious envoys with hidden identities flocked to Curseland Castle from all directions. They wanted to meet Grimm, who had just won a battle, and obtain the most practical promise from him. The first thing they saw when they arrived at the Crimson Fleet's base was the undamaged Curseland Castle that had gone through the cruel war. Many of the envoys who came to Curseland Castle all year round had a trace of doubt. The castle in front of them was exactly the same as before, and there seemed to be no changes. However, when their gazes fell on the castle, they felt a strange sense of unfamiliarity. It was as if this was the first time they had seen Curseland Castle. With this strange feeling, the secret envoys of the various families stepped into Curseland Castle. Once they entered the castle, this feeling became even stronger. It was the same castle gate, the same gray stone plaza, the same pale golden stone corridor, the same mental suppression, and even the magic aura flowing in the stone walls were the same. However, the emissary's nostrils were filled with a thick stench of blood, and what lingered in his ears were the terrifying screams of souls. There were even faintly discernible blood-sobbing souls in every corner. Everything pointed to the fact that a terrible blood sacrifice had just been carried out here, and the targets of the blood sacrifice were most likely the Intim family sorcerers who had never been heard from again. More than 200 sorcerers, and there were as many as 7 grade 3 sorcerers. Such a large number of sorcerers had all been sacrificed. Every time they thought of this, the envoys sent by the various sorcerer families felt a chill in their hearts, and even their steps became stiff. There were so many envoys from the various families, and Grimm naturally could not meet them one by one. Only the large sorcerer families could meet him personally. As for the remaining small and medium-sized families and sorcerer organizations, they could only visit Meryl and ask her to pass on some secret agreements and terms. Since the war had just ended, the surroundings were already in ruins, so these envoys could only temporarily stay in Curseland Castle. However, after staying for only one night, all the sorcerers moved out at the same time. They would rather build a mud hut in the wilderness and barbecue some wild food than take another step into Curseland Castle. That night of continuous nightmares almost drove them crazy. According to some private rumors, on the night he stayed in the castle, he suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and was shocked to find that he was not lying on the warm and comfortable bed, but in a horrifying pool of blood that was almost overflowing. In the blood pool, there were broken skulls, broken limbs, broken intestines, white breasts, and countless terrifying souls of the dead that almost filled the surface of the pool. The souls of the dead kept crawling out of the pool. Their gray faces were extremely twisted because of the pain, and they stretched out their broken arms, letting out despairing and mournful wails. As for the walls, floor, and ceiling of the room, they were all covered by a layer of strange gray substance. The gray substance constantly wriggled and expanded, and on the surface grew thick tubes that looked like blood vessels. The walls of the tubes were the color of flesh and translucent. Glug, glug, glug. There was a viscous purplish-black liquid flowing inside, and one could faintly see the remnants of undigested flesh and blood. Living in the castle gave him a strange feeling that he was living in the intestines of a strange life form. It was this feeling that made him move out in a hurry, and he did not dare to casually step into Cursling Castle anymore. This Cursling Castle was not the Cursling Castle of the past. It had already undergone some kind of mutation and became a strange creature that had both the characteristics of an alchemy life and a flesh and blood life form. Therefore, those with keen senses chose to stay away from it under their instincts. In fact, it was not just these foreign envoys. Even a few high-ranking members of the Crimson family temporarily stayed in the giant floating ship and did not dare to spend the night in Cursling Castle. The whole of Cursling Castle currently only had two tenants, Grim and Mary. Of course, the Shadow Fiend always followed Grim by his side, staying close to him to protect him. As for Grim's decision to stay in Cursling Castle, it was not to torture himself, but to further subdue this strange life form that had escaped the cage of life and the shackles of witchcraft. Yes, the current Cursling Castle had all the characteristics of an intelligent life form. If not for the lack of a permanent energy source, perhaps even Grim would have a hard time restraining this forbidden life form that had devoured the entire Intim family. Compared to normal intelligent life forms, the biggest difference between forbidden life forms and normal intelligent life forms was that their growth and strength could not be separated from taboo methods such as blood sacrifice, slaughter, or destruction. Although the wizards usually looked like they had no taboo, they still had to abide by the basic rules of the wizards, and they could not easily harm the low-level creatures of the same plane. This was also a wizard convention for the sustainable development of the entire wizard civilization. You could choose not to abide by it, but once your evil deeds were publicized, all wizard organizations and forces would blacklist you and no longer have any resources or knowledge exchange with you. Some wizards who hated evil would even take the initiative to hunt you down, and this kind of hunting would not be restricted by the wizard rules. Hence, considering the severe consequences, no magus dared to openly carry out a massacre or blood sacrifice. Of course, everything that was carried out behind the scenes would not be a problem as long as they were clean. Every year, a group of sorcerer apprentices would quietly die in those private sorcerer towers. Most of them had become the victims of individual wizards' dangerous witchcraft or forbidden experiments. Most of the wizard organizations chose to turn a blind eye to this, and they would not conduct too much investigation. Chapter 1325. Grim slowly awoke from the bloody nightmare. Although he did not scream in fright, his face was still pale. It could not be helped. Anyone who had been soaked in blood every day, surrounded by wailing souls, would not be in a good mood. Mary stood by his side, taking out a handkerchief and gently wiping the sweat off his forehead. "How is it? Did you find its soul core?" Grim smiled wryly and shook his head. This Coastland had actually sacrificed all the lives in the castle on the battlefield, and then fell into a deep slumber. If Grim wanted to control it once and for all, he could only sneak into its nightmare weave to search for the soul core that it had hidden. If he found it and controlled it, he would have another forbidden life form under his command. Nightmare Castle Coastland. According to the AI Chip's calculations, Coastland had the basic strength of a rank 4 before the blood sacrifice. After the blood sacrifice, Coastland would have the basic strength of a rank 4. If Grim was willing to equip him with a super magic furnace, then Kesslin would be comparable to a super expert to a certain extent. Of course, Coslin's battle prowess mainly depended on the nightmare aura and nightmare transformation. There was still a huge gap between him and an ultimate being. However, if an ultimate being were to accidentally fall into Coslin's nightmare weave, what awaited them would be endless nightmares. A single blood sacrifice had devoured so many magi, including the rank 4 freed and 7 rank 3 magi. This meal could very well push Coslin to the level of a forbidden life form. The potential of a forbidden life form was hard to predict. According to the AI chip's calculations, a fully grown Nightmare Castle Coslin would have the potential to reach rank 6. This was already extremely terrifying for most creatures of the plane. Hence, Grimm had to find its soul core before it completely digested this power. Otherwise, he would lose the chance to control this monster forever. If he forcefully controlled a forbidden life form, what awaited Grimm would one day be a backlash. If Grimm had always been stronger than Coslin, he might have become a docile servant. However, once Grimm's strength weakened, Coslin would definitely launch a ferocious counterattack. This was not a guess, but a certainty. Therefore, Grimm's current situation was either to find the soul core and truly control Coslin, or to destroy it before Coslin matured. There was no other way. How about I give it a try? Mary gritted her teeth and said resolutely. If he wanted to find Coslin's soul core, he could only take the initiative to enter deep into the nightmare weave. Although Coslin had fallen into a deep sleep and was unable to operate the nightmare weave, he could only rely on his instincts. The operation of such a system was enough to put a Tier 4 sorcerer at great risk. Even Grimm had to be careful every time he barged into the nightmare weave, afraid that he would awaken Coslin's budding consciousness. Under such circumstances, it would be extremely difficult to find the unknown color, size, and shape of the soul core. However, considering that he could obtain a future Grade 6 forbidden life form, Grimm felt that the risk and price were worth it. Therefore, when Mary volunteered, Grimm hesitated for a moment before smiling and extending his hand in a gentlemanly manner. How could I let a beautiful lady go alone? I'll accompany you. Mary smiled sweetly and placed her slender and fair right hand in Grimm's wide palm. The next moment, their consciousness fused together, as if they had touched something strange. Their vision blurred, and they appeared in a completely different scene. It was the time when the curtain of night had fallen. They were at the entrance of a tall and majestic light golden castle. They were standing on the gray stone plaza. Carriages filled with guests drove past and stopped, and pairs of men and women in luxurious clothes walked out of the carriages, brimming with the elegance and nobility of nobles. The men were refined, while the women were noble and charming. With graceful figures, they held each other's hands and walked into the castle in pairs, which was filled with laughter and laughter. In front of them, there was a male attendant in a tuxedo holding a silver tray, and a pretty maid in a white maid uniform with rabbit ears. They bowed and made way for them. What appeared in front of them was a luxurious banquet filled with an extravagant and joyous atmosphere. All the guests were either chatting in groups of 2s and 3s with wine glasses in their hands, or walking down the dance floor hand in hand to dance to the elegant and melodious music, or hiding under a dimly lit screen window or a flower shed, whispering to each other. This kind of banquet was an essential part of the noble's etiquette. Mary got off the carriage with Grimm's help. She looked around and said calmly, "This is the gray stone plaza in front of the castle. It seems that Coslin's imagination is still lacking, and he can only project scenes from reality into dreams." Grimm smiled and wrapped his arm around Mary's slender waist. The two of them followed the crowd into the banquet hall. This is only the nightmare aura that Coslin unintentionally emitted after his slumber. It's not the real nightmare weave, so it's naturally much more peaceful. Grimm had entered this dream countless times, so he was naturally more familiar with it. At this moment, Mary was wearing a bright red chiffon dress, revealing her fair collarbone, shoulders, neck, and jade-like arms. The hem of the dress did not even reach her knees, revealing her round and firm thighs and straight, slender calves. She was wearing a pair of transparent crystal shoes. Grimm, on the other hand, was wearing a well-ironed black evening gown. His well-built body tightened his clothes, accentuating his perfect figure. His dark red hair was tied up behind him, and he had black eyebrows, black eyes, a straight nose, and tightly pursed lips. He was brimming with a straightforward aura. The two of them leaned against each other as they approached the entrance, looking at the bustling banquet hall. Mary's small hand had unknowingly touched Grimm's waist, and she had a strange expression on her face. She said calmly, "This is the nightmare you were talking about? If all nightmares are like this, then I'd rather be haunted by nightmares every day." "Oomph." Grimm shook his head and laughed, saying in a low voice, "Do you think a nightmare world created by a taboo life form would be as pure as other illusions? What that coastline used here is to first suppress his desires. He first gave you a beautiful moment, then ruthlessly destroyed this beautiful moment. When changes happen later, don't spit it out." Mary laughed coldly. "No matter what, I'm still the famous Blood Queen. What kind of horror do you think can scare me? By the way, how many times have you gone in and out? Do you have any clues?" As they spoke, the two of them did not enter the hall, but walked slowly along the small path in front of the door to a side hall. The green vines wrapped around the flower canopy was elegant and secluded, giving off a unique flavor. At this moment, two young and cute deer-like girls ran past them. One of the bolder ones even blew a kiss at Grimm, then ran over with a giggle. "It's a soul body." Mary frowned and could not help but whisper. Grimm nodded. "Everyone who appears in this banquet hall is a soul body, including our current form. The core of that Koslin's soul is hiding here, waiting to start a feast of slaughter." The whole banquet is roughly divided into two stages. The first stage is the peaceful period, just like now, where we can move freely. The second stage is the season of slaughter. At that time, everyone in the banquet will fall into a frenzy of killing, and that coastline will use the power of their deaths to transform into a nightmare monster, which is quite difficult to deal with. Hearing Grimm's evaluation of the nightmare coastline, Mary's heart trembled slightly. Grimm was a legendary fire wizard with the strength of a super strong person. If even he felt that it was difficult to deal with, one could only imagine how strong the other party was. Fortunately, this was only the realm of nightmare emitted by the real Koslin's will, and not the real nightmare weave. Thus, the coastline that appeared here was only a nightmare projection of his huge will. Even if he encountered danger, he would be safe as long as he could escape from the castle projected by his will. Grimm was explaining the results of his investigation to Mary in a low voice when a dark red light suddenly shone in the hall not far away. Following that, the gentle music that lingered in the hall suddenly changed, becoming eerie and terrifying. The hall was filled with the terrifying roars of monsters, mixed with the screams of hundreds of men and women. "The killing stage has begun. Let's not waste any more time. Where are you going to search?" Grimm's smile gradually disappeared, and he said solemnly. Mary glanced around and said coldly, "I'm on the 3rd floor." Grimm did not waste any time and said, "The killing stage only lasts for a quarter of an hour. After that, Koslin's nightmare consciousness will be able to be projected. When that time comes, you have to return to the entrance of the castle in time. Otherwise, his nightmare consciousness here has the strength of a pinnacle level 4. Mary did not hesitate, and a pair of blood-red bat wings appeared behind her, supporting her body as she slowly ascended to the 3rd floor of the castle. Grimm turned around and walked towards the howling hall on the 1st floor. As he walked, his clothes changed strangely, and the flaming coral wizard staff and the Book of Darkness slowly appeared in his hands. Chapter 13:26. The hall had now become a purgatory of flesh and blood. The noble guests who had been elegant and refined before had now torn off their masks of hypocrisy and began to madly chase and kill each other. They had no weapons. What they used were the most instinctive weapons of the human body, teeth and limbs. They wrestled, bit, and gnawed at each other, using all means to attack the targets around them. They had already lost all human etiquette and reason, and were like a bunch of wild beasts pouncing and biting each other. Their faces were distorted, and they opened their mouths as wide as they could. They did not even care if the corners of their mouths were torn. They pounced on the nearest target, opened their mouths wide, and revealed sharp teeth dripping with blood. They ruthlessly bit down on the other party's neck or body. Once bitten, they would not let go. They howled like wild beasts as they shook their heads with all their might. Every time they tore off a large piece of flesh from the other party's body. Every time a prey fell, 7 or 8 people with bloodshot eyes and mouths full of blood pounced on it and tore it into pieces. There was no one alive in the hall. Everyone was a group of wild beasts who had fallen into a feast of flesh and blood. They had no allies or partners. Every living creature was their enemy. Even the young men and women who were dancing and hugging each other just a moment ago were now lying on the ground, roaring like wild beasts and attacking each other like wild beasts. Just as Grimm approached the entrance of the hall, 2 male attendants in well-ironed clothes who were slightly closer suddenly raised their heads. Their mouths were stained with blood, and their hands were dripping with blood. Beneath them was a beautiful lady in a gorgeous evening gown lying on her back. Half of her neck was missing, and her broken throat was exposed. His chest was badly mutilated, and large chunks of flesh and blood had disappeared. However, what was surprising was that even with such heavy injuries, the noble woman did not die. Instead, she turned her head crazily and kept opening and closing her mouth, as if she wanted to tear something apart. Beep. The host is continuously affected by the nightmare halo and has entered the shallow layer of the nightmare weave. The feast of massacre has begun. Please find Kozlin's soul core as soon as possible. Otherwise, after he absorbs enough power from the blood sacrifice, his strength will gradually increase. The killing feast is the first stage. Kozlin's basic strength is estimated to be at Tier 4 Intermediate. In 7 minutes and 13 seconds, he will enter the second stage. Kozlin's strength is estimated to be at Tier 4 Advanced. In 16 minutes and 28 seconds, he will enter the third stage. His strength is estimated to be at Tier 4 Peak. In 28 minutes and 46 seconds, he will enter the fourth stage. When the time comes, the main body's chances of winning against it in the nightmare weave will be infinitely close to 0. The AI. Chip's prompt lingered in Grimm's mind. In his dream, the 2 monstrous waiters suddenly jumped up from the ground and pounced at him. The AI. Chip scanned it, and a string of data appeared. Hungry nightmare ghost, spirit-type creature, Tier 1 Intermediate, transformed from the creatures killed in Nightmare Castle. The core of its soul was resentment, and it hated all living things. No physical damage, double elemental damage. Afraid of elemental damage? A cold smile appeared on Grimm's face. With a light flick of his fingers, 2 purple fireballs the size of eggs flew out and hit their bodies. Although the fireballs were small, they were unprecedentedly powerful. Asterisk bang bang. Asterisk as soon as the purple fireball touched their bodies, it immediately burst into surging purple flames, wrapping their entire bodies in it. They were only Grade 1 spirits, and in the face of Grimm's powerful magic attacks, they did not even have the chance to resist before turning into ashes. Without the suppression of the 2 hungry ghosts, the lady who had been half-eaten flipped over and used her crippled hands to claw at the floor. She let out strange cries as she crawled towards Grimm. Her mouth opened and closed incessantly, and she had a ferocious look on her face. Before she could even crawl to his feet, a ring of flames shot out from Grimm's body, turning the lady into ashes in an instant. The appearance of the high-temperature flames immediately caused the hungry ghosts in the hall to be stunned. They stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Grimm, who was standing at the entrance of the hall. A scarlet flame quickly ignited in the depths of their eyes. Asterisk roar. Asterisk all the hungry ghosts screamed mournfully and crawled down at the same time, pouncing towards Grimm. Grimm grasped the flaming coral staff in his hand, and with a slight shake, an even larger ring of flames surged out. All the hungry ghosts that came into contact with the ring of flames did not even have the chance to cry out before they were instantly turned to ashes. However, what surprised Grimm was that no matter how powerful his fire spell was, it seemed to only be able to kill the hungry ghosts and not damage the castle at all. The smooth and clean floor was still as bright as ever. The terrifyingly high-temperature flames covered it for a long time, but not a single burn mark could be seen. The hungry ghosts that could easily be destroyed with a wave of their hands began to surge out from every corner of the castle, stopping Grimm in his tracks and making it difficult for him to advance. Chip, these spirits can't be killed. A few consecutive waves of flames killed thousands of hungry ghosts, but the number that surged out did not decrease. Grimm finally realized that something was wrong. Beep. These spirits are the souls of the dead that were bound by Nightmare Castle. The core of their resentment is in Coslin's hands. As long as Coslin's soul is not destroyed, these spirits can be projected endlessly. So, these were not the bodies of the spirits, but the projections of their resentment. Grimm grunted and snapped his fingers again. A dark red barrier shot out, forming a light membrane with a radius of 10 meters and blocking all the enemies outside. As long as the hungry ghosts pounced into the light membrane, they would be incinerated into ashes by the dark red flames, even without Grimm's attack. Blazing Domain. This was the blazing domain that Grimm had obtained after advancing to become a fire wizard. In the outside world, Grimm's blazing domain could easily overturn a large barrier that spanned over 1,000 meters. But here, under the suppression of Coslin's nightmare domain, the blazing domain could only extend to an area of around 10 meters, and its power was undoubtedly much weaker. However, it was more than enough to incinerate these hungry ghosts who were only at rank 1. As he used the blazing domain to exterminate these hateful, hungry ghosts, Grimm glanced around, scanning everything in the hall. After all, this was not the real world, but a projection of Coslin's nightmare domain. Hence, Coslin's soul core could exist in any form in this place. The only way to find it was to make it jump out on its own accord. Asterisk whoosh. Asterisk, a malevolent figure clawed through the fiery barrier in front of Grimm, and the other party was turned into a fireball by the blazing domain and the recoil of the flames. It struggled and howled for a few seconds before turning into ashes. Its rank has increased? Grimm was slightly taken aback and immediately noticed the new information that the AI chip projected in his mind. Nightmare Domain, middle level. Nightmare creatures have increased in rank. Despair Spectre, spirit-type creature, rank 2. Its main body possesses an astonishing number of vengeful spirits. Hate Hound, spirit-type creature, rank 2. Specializes in biting and pouncing attacks. Only now did Grimm notice that the monster he had incinerated was a Hate Hound. It did not have a single strand of hair on its body, and there were large festers and abscesses all over its body. The only strange thing about it was that it had 2 heads, which made it look extremely ugly and sinister. It was said that the Cerberus of the Abyss was the ultimate form of the Hate Hound. All of them had the same strange ability, and that was Flash. Just as this thought appeared in Grimm's mind, 6 or 7 malevolent and terrifying figures suddenly appeared around him. They appeared outside of the fiery barrier in an instant, opening their huge mouths and tearing at the stone in a frenzy. The flames of the blazing domain spread across their bodies, causing them to howl in pain. However, it did not affect their fighting strength at all. They did not seem to fear death at all. Even if their entire bodies were engulfed in dark red flames that soared into the sky, they still attacked the fiery barrier with all their might. Another 3 sides of Grimm's flame shield were torn apart, and the 7 Hate Hounds were burnt to a crisp. As soon as the Hate Hounds died, a bone-chilling ghost howl suddenly sounded outside of the blazing domain. Illusory ghost faces gushed out from the body of a seductress and madly rushed into the blazing domain surrounding Grimm. Although the flames of the blazing domain burned most of the ghost faces, there were still some that broke through the layers of defense and appeared in front of Grimm. The Book of Darkness in Grimm's hand suddenly emitted a pale green light, and an invisible force field spread out, sucking every ghost face that got close to Grim into a small vortex that extended out of the cover of the book. The seductress seemed to have sensed something was wrong, and she raised her head and let out a shrill scream. Immediately, the same scream echoed in every corner of the castle, and half-real seductresses wearing light muslin clothes emerged from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. In a flash, Grim was surrounded so tightly that not even a drop of water could escape. The Despair Ghost was a terrifying monster that was transformed from a spirit body. Their bodies were bound by an inexhaustible amount of human despair. Any magus that was entangled by them would usually end up committing suicide if they could not withstand the impact of the terrifying despair. It had been almost 7 minutes, and they were about to enter the second phase of the nightmare domain. Grim also noticed that the more he killed, the more terrifying the energy aura of the entire nightmare castle became. The countless nightmare creatures absorbed this terrifying energy and were in the midst of rapid evolution and growth. After only 5 minutes of fighting, there were already rank 2 nightmare creatures. What kind of monsters would appear in the second phase? As Grim pondered silently, the AI chip's prompt appeared. Chapter 1327. The entire nightmare castle began to tremble. It was as if a terrifying beast that had been slumbering for tens of thousands of years was slowly awakening. The entire castle was filled with a bloody, cruel, and tyrannical aura. The nightmare creatures that had been pouring in from all over the castle no longer pounced towards Grim. Instead, they gathered at a corner of the hall and gathered into a gray, soft-bodied monster. As the creatures continued to fuse in, the gray monster continued to expand. It gradually filled up every gap in the hall and began to squeeze towards Grim. Beep. Grade 4 energy detected. Initial analysis. This creature is at the beginning of Grade 4. The AI chip's prompt made Grim's heart skip a beat. This was only the second stage, and there was already a Grade 4 nightmare creature. Just how powerful would it be in the later stages? Grim did not dare to let the opponent continue to grow unbridledly. He waved his staff, and a stream of golden flames with terrifying heat met the strange, soft-bodied creature head-on. The golden flames and the gray monster collided. Strange, sizzling sounds of burning flesh could be heard in the hall, and a pungent smell quickly spread out. Asterisk creak, creak, creak. Asterisk the gray monster seemed to feel pain and began to twist and struggle frantically. Its body was so swollen that it almost filled up the entire hall. As a result, the slightest movement caused the entire castle to tremble and shake. The gray monster twisted its body frantically, flinging out balls of strange liquid that looked like snot. The moment the liquid landed on the ground, it slowly bulged and transformed into something that looked like a venomous ooze monster. They dragged their greasy, jelly-like bodies on the floor, and as they neared Grim, they spat out gray mucus. Fortunately, Grim had the burning domain to block them and the lava shield to protect himself, so he did not have to worry about these tiny creatures. However, their existence did hinder Grim's battle with the gray monster. The book of filthiness in Grim's right hand began to flip according to his will. Every time a page was flipped, an ugly plague creature would jump out from within. As soon as these fearless servant corpses landed on the ground, they charged at the Uzis without hesitation. When they were within a certain distance of each other, the servant corpses' stomachs that were as large as a bell exploded. Terrifying waves of plague poison and thousands of pieces of bone and skin rained down in all directions like a storm. The originally gray ooze monster immediately turned purple. Even its movement and the speed at which it spat out acid became abnormally slow. The most terrifying thing about nightmare creatures was the despair that came with their attacks, which could induce strong negative reactions in their enemies. Unfortunately, plague creatures were not creatures of flesh and blood, so they naturally did not have such negative emotions. However, the plague creatures mainly relied on spreading the plague virus to attack their enemies. Now that they had encountered a nightmare creature that did not fall for the same trick, their attacks became futile. Since their special methods were ineffective against each other, the only thing that was left was a bloody melee. The servant corpses charged forward fiercely, but they were either turned into sieves by the enemy's acid, swallowed by the ooze monsters and digested into a puddle of black liquid, or exploded into a cloud of black smoke and covered their enemies with a layer of green plague spores. The center of the hall was the battlefield. The plague creatures and nightmare creatures were locked in a fierce battle, but it also hindered Grimm's progress. Compared to Grimm's abyss of suffering, Mary's side was calm. Perhaps it was due to Mary's special constitution. The Nightmare Castle did not show any malice towards her. Instead, it resonated with her soul. Mary's message indicated that she had found clues to Coslin's soul core and was exploring deeper into the nightmare weave. Since that was the case, Grimm gave up on the idea of meeting up with her and began to fight the nightmare creatures wholeheartedly. As for Coslin, it was obvious that he was in a deep slumber to fuse with the enormous power obtained from the blood sacrifice. The only thing Grimm could do now was to attract the enemy's attention to himself, giving Mary a chance to sneak into the deeper parts of the nightmare weave. With that thought in mind, Grimm transformed without hesitation. Violent and ferocious crimson flames gushed out from every pore of his body, forming a sea of raging flames around him. His body was burning hot, and it began to expand rapidly. Molten Giant. Ever since he reached Tier 4, he could only transform into the Molten Giant to bear the surging pure flame energy and the mysterious law of fire in his body. A normal human body could deal with small situations, but if he wanted to fight with all his might, his body would not be able to withstand the power of the law of fire. Before he could hurt the enemy, the law of fire would have already melted Grimm's body. Of course, this was also because Grimm had not completely grasped the law of fire. If he had really made the law of fire a part of him, how could fire hurt him? The Molten Giant that Grimm transformed into was 12 meters tall, and it was not something that the small castle hall could bear. When he completed his transformation, the top of his head reached the top of the hall. The terrifying flames that swirled around him crazily licked the floor beneath his feet and the ceiling above his head, causing them to crackle. However, they did not melt into liquid lava like before. After transforming into the Molten Giant, many of his fire spells no longer required incantations. It was like a special ability of his race, and he could activate them with a wave of his hand. Grimm took large strides forward, the flames around him spreading outwards crazily. In an instant, the entire hall was within the range of the burning domain. At the same time, an indescribable heavy pressure came from all directions, colliding with Grimm's consciousness, trying to suppress the overflowing power back into his body. Oomph! Grimm grunted, using the Book of Darkness to protect his body and mind, and focusing most of his mental strength into the Vulcan bead. Immediately, waves of violent and ferocious magic flames began to swirl like a hurricane, sweeping through every corner of the hall. The gray monster in front of Grimm was immediately ravaged by the terrifying flames. So what if it was a grade 4 nightmare creature? Under the repeated attacks of the two divine weapons, the gray monster's body was scorched black, and its body became smaller and smaller. No matter how many nightmare creatures continued to fuse into it, it could not change the fact that it was shrinking rapidly. However, just as Grimm was torturing the gray nightmare creature, the Chip's prompt suddenly appeared in his mind. Time's up. Entering the third stage of Nightmare Weave. As soon as the prompt sounded, the situation in front of him changed strangely. The basic grade 4 gray plague monster had suddenly self-destructed. Its huge gray body exploded into balls of soft liquid, spreading to every corner of the hall and quickly fusing with it. In the next second, the entire nightmare castle suddenly came back to life. Densely packed gray biological substance seeped out from the floor, walls, and ceiling, quickly fusing together. In a moment, the entire hall, apart from the area controlled by Grimm's burning domain, was completely covered by this biological substance. They swelled up and down, their surface covered in moist mucus and wrinkled patterns. From afar, they looked like the intestines and acidic fluids of flesh creatures. And Grimm was obviously the food in their intestines. In every corner and secret room of the castle that Grimm could not see, there were cocoons that seemed to be piled up from flesh and blood, expanding and contracting rhythmically. Inside each cocoon bubble, one could see some grotesquely shaped embryos of strange creatures floating in the wretched green liquid. When Grimm's incomparably violent flame aura wreaked havoc in the nightmare castle, the monsters in the cocoons could not help but become restless. Those guys that were already mature or close to mature couldn't wait any longer as they tore open the membrane and crawled out from the muddy yellow liquid. They shook their ugly and twisted bodies and raised their sinister heads to sniff the air with their nostrils. Then, they immediately roared and pounced towards the direction where the flame aura was coming from. Standing in the hall, Grimm, who was cleaning up these annoying meat walls, suddenly raised his head and silently sensed for a moment. He could clearly feel that the tyrannical aura in the surroundings was becoming stronger. Apart from the cruel and tyrannical aura, a strange emotion that could cause one's mind to decline was growing in the depths of one's heart. Just like how the law of fire could produce flames without the aid of any combustibles, this strange emotion could also break through the defenses of a human's heart, planting the seeds of despair in their hearts and watering them little by little. And the nutrients for its growth were all the negative emotions in the human heart. This also meant that in the nightmare weave, as long as one's heart was not completely cold, the enemy could use the law to provoke one's negative emotions, causing one's mind and consciousness to gradually sink into darkness. The only thing that could resist one type of law was another type of law. The Book of Darkness in Grimm's hand produced a ray of law light, forcefully repelling the negative emotions from the nightmare weave. But unknowingly, Grimm's pitch-black eyes were gradually covered with a layer of dark red light, and the luster of his spirit began to dim. At this time, Grimm's opponent was no longer an ordinary nightmare creature, but the nightmare castle that was gradually recovering. As for the nightmare creatures that were constantly attacking using the meat walls, their individual levels had risen to mid-tier 3. Chapter 1328. Although the nightmare castle had awakened, it had no hands, legs, or sharp claws. Hence, the job of cleaning up its enemies could only be handed over to the nightmare creatures under its control. In essence, the nightmare creatures were just a bunch of spirits that appeared in the nightmare weave through the projection of their souls. However, ever since Cothrin's blood sacrifice had devoured all of Megacentum, it had transformed from a pure alchemy life form into a monster with the characteristics of a flesh and blood creature. In other words, it had a life and a soul, possessing everything an intelligent life form should have. The only problem now was that Cothrin's advancement had been through blood sacrifice, and his soul was filled with a murderous and tyrannical aura. Once it awoke from its slumber, it could mutate into some terrifying forbidden life form. If such a fellow could not be controlled and allowed to wreak havoc in the scattered towers, it would be a calamity for the central continent. However, if it could be controlled, it would be an excellent wizard slave for any Magus organization or organization. After all, a wizard slave with the potential to develop to rank 6 was extremely rare, and those that could be used by magi were even rarer. If Mary could successfully control Cothrin's soul core, then the combination of Mary and Cothrin would definitely not be inferior to Lich Kongness. Of course, this referred to the Lich before he had obtained the austere Winter's Chest, and not the extremely powerful Frost Lich now. Ever since he had obtained the austere Winter's Chest, Lich Kongness had hidden in his skeletal plane and had not shown his face. Even if Grimm had invited him, he would only send a few rank 4 underlings to deal with the situation. If Grimm had not used the necropolis of the Death God to summon him out for a while, it would probably be difficult to see his true body for hundreds of years. According to the AI, Chip's observations, Lich Kongness's assimilation with the austere Winter's Chest was very successful. He had now reached the peak of rank 4, and possessed the strength of a powerful being. Furthermore, the power of ice that he had absorbed had perfectly fused with his own power of death, forming a unique frozen death aura. In battle, it could even extend the cold air of death to its undead minions in the form of a halo, adding another magical effect to their physical attacks, soul freeze. He thought about the undead army that filled the entire plane. He thought about how each and every one of them had the ability to freeze souls. Every time an attack landed on an enemy's body, the enemy's soul would become sluggish, their thoughts frozen, and they would be unable to retaliate no matter how they attacked. Such a powerful and terrifying ability was only the result of his initial fusion. Given a few centuries, he would be able to fuse the austere chest into his soul and reach the 5th stage, becoming the first Frost Lich in the multiverse to wield the freezing aura of death. Everyone was silently advancing or becoming stronger, and Grimm naturally did not dare to slack off. Even though he had now firmly occupied a dominant position in the central continent, he still did not let go of any opportunity or challenge that could enhance his own strength. Compared to Grimm's smooth sailing, Mary's future was much more troublesome. For a vampire wizard like her, success or failure depended on her bloodline. Everything she had was given to her by her bloodline. The speed at which she ascended in the early stages was as if she had cheats. However, once she lost her bloodline or touched the bloodline shackles, her path forward would be cut off. It would be hard for her to take even half a step forward. For Blood Meridian sorcerers, if they didn't have a great opportunity, they wouldn't be able to break the shackles of their bloodline and ascend to become a true high-level life form. While Mary's talent was decent, it was only decent. Compared to the genius wizards, Mary's talent for vampirism was low. Had it not been for the large amounts of dragon blood and lance, Mary would have needed at least another 700 to 800 years to reach her current level. That would be the time for her to use her talent and hard work to fight for her life. It had to be said that Mary's encounter with Grimm was a stroke of luck and fate. The fact that she could trust Grimm wholeheartedly was something that should not exist in the sorcerer world, where people only cared about benefits and deceit. However, it was the existence of this weird mentality and emotion that freed Mary and Grimm. There was no blood relation, no contract, no conflict of interest, but they could trust each other from the bottom of their hearts. This could no longer be described as ordinary feelings. It was because of his trust in Mary that Grimm was willing to go all out against the Nightmare Castle. With Grimm's elemental vision and spiritual perception, he could see that the interior of the Nightmare Castle was filled with all sorts of distorted and strange force field undulations. These force fields overlapped with each other, intertwining and mutating, changing the original nature of the force fields. It was because of their overly complicated changes that it made it difficult for external probes to advance. When Grimm had first entered the castle, his domain and spiritual perception had been suppressed to the point where it was difficult for them to leave his body. This was the main reason. Now, with the AI chip's high-efficiency analysis and data analysis, Grimm had finally grasped the curves and undulations of the force fields within the Nightmare Castle. Only then did he unleash the might of the Inferno domain, incinerating the terrifying enemies that swarmed towards him into charcoal, keeping them at a distance of 10 steps. It couldn't be helped. After entering the second stage of Nightmare Weave, almost all the nightmare creatures that appeared in front of Grimm were rank 2 or 3. Though they could not truly be Grimm's opponents, they relied on their fearless charge and terrifying numbers to hold him back in the Great Hall. Using the time gained from the nightmare creatures, the Nightmare Castle was also in the midst of rapid changes. The wall-like substance seemed to cover every corner of the castle, and Grimm could even faintly hear a muffled thumping sound that sounded like a war drum from within the Great Hall. Heartbeat. This was the heartbeat of the Nightmare Castle after it had been revived. Time's up, beginning the third stage of Nightmare Weave. The moment the AI chip's prompt disappeared, the strange heartbeat also disappeared. The entire Nightmare Castle suddenly became abnormally quiet. An unprecedented berserk force swept down from the upper levels of the castle, converging with the complex force field undulations inside, pressing down on Grimm. Before the battle at Shattered Stone Canyon, perhaps Grimm could rely on his vitality of 26 to withstand this attack. Now, however, Grimm's expression changed. He could only gather a vast amount of fire energy to block in front of him, blocking the powerful force that was pressing down on him. Asterisk bang. Asterisk with a loud explosion. The 12-meter-tall molten giant was sent flying out of the Nightmare Castle like a baseball that had been struck, only coming to a stop after smashing through the gates of the manor. Peak Grade 4. It was only the third stage, but it already had the strength of a Peak Grade 4, and it had actually forced him out of the Nightmare Castle. This was not a good start. Grimm pondered as he slowly pulled his body out from the wall. Scorching flames roasted the walls, turning the rocks within the human-shaped gap red. Then, they turned into soft lava that flowed down. In front of him, the Nightmare Castle that stood quietly in its original spot, like an ancient ferocious beast, was wriggling its body slowly. An unprecedentedly powerful soul undulation rose from the depths of the castle, crashing towards Grimm like a small mountain. A sharp glint flashed in Grimm's eyes, and his tall molten giant suddenly stood upright like a mountain. His spiritual force mixed with the 4 laws of fire met the attack head-on. Asterisk boom. Asterisk a muffled sound rang out. The formless and intangible mental powers collided in the void, stirring up ripples visible to the naked eye. The sky above the nightmare weave was like a piece of parchment, distorting and wrinkling to a terrifying degree. The terrifying sound of paper tearing could be heard in the air. This kind of spiritual collision couldn't be faked at all. It was like 2 powerful life forms abandoning casting techniques and combat methods, directly colliding with each other with the power of their hearts and souls. What they were competing on was the strength of their mental strength, the strength of their souls, and the tenacity of their willpower. Grimm had the Book of Darkness to protect his mind and the Vulcan orb as the core. In this aspect, he was clearly superior to Koslin. Although Koslin was half an alchemist, and his physical and mental toughness were far above that of human magi, he was still inferior to Grimm, who had 2 godly weapons in his hands. After the collision, Grimm was forced to retreat continuously. Every time the thick and sturdy giant molten leg took a step back, it would leave a 2-meter-deep footprint in the ground. The footprint was filled with boiling red molten lava, causing the ground to sizzle from the heat. The Nightmare Castle, which was 100 times larger than Grimm, was not having an easy time either. Visible to the naked eye, dazzling flames erupted from every part of the castle. Thick black smoke wafted out of the castle and slowly rose into the sky. The Nightmare Castle trembled violently, and the embossed decorations on the outer walls fell down. A deep crack extended from the castle's foundation up to the 4th floor of the castle. The huge and complicated force field walls that surrounded the castle crackled and exploded nonstop. This collision had successfully tested the basic strength of the 2. Koslin, who had used the Nightmare Castle as his main body, had completely suppressed Grimm in terms of strength and vitality. However, in terms of spiritual force, he was clearly weaker. Perhaps Koslin's most obvious weakness was his mobility. After all, he was just a life form transformed from an alchemy castle, so his mobility was close to 0. If not for the Nightmare Weave's special consciousness domain, he would have been perfectly suppressed by Grimm's powerful fire spells. After the first attack failed, the Nightmare Castle trembled again and began to prepare another consciousness attack. Grimm, who had sworn not to retreat, could only sway his molten body and meet the attack head-on. As he fought with Koslin, Grimm secretly sent a message to Mary. Chapter 1329. The walls in front of her were shaking violently. Hordes of nightmare creatures surged through the dim corridor, heading towards the battlefield. In the shadows above the corridor where they couldn't see, a palm-sized, inconspicuous black shadow was crawling forward slowly and firmly. The surface of its body was covered in furry hair, and its sharp claws lightly grasped the gaps between the rocks as it silently moved forward while sticking close to the shadows on the ceiling. The battle outside the castle was still intense, and this could be seen from the trembling walls and the rate at which the nightmare creatures were being consumed. This was the fourth floor of the nightmare castle, and the nightmare creatures that came out of the secret rooms and tunnels were all at least grade 3. They were terrifying monsters that could oppress an entire region if they were outside. But here, it was just a consumable in a high-level battle. Mary was not as strong as Grimm, and she could not fight Cothran head-on. Therefore, she was exposed. She would definitely be surrounded by the powerful grade 3 nightmare creatures. But what surprised Mary was that after sneaking in from the 3rd floor of the castle, her movements were unprecedentedly smooth. Although the castle was filled with a shocking number of nightmare creatures and was filled with terrifying magic traps, there seemed to be an invisible god silently guiding her in her mind. What route to take, where the traps were, when to wait quietly, when to move forward without worry. Under the guidance of the tiny voice, Mary broke through the obstacles, bypassing the hidden sentries and traps, and reached the 4th floor of the castle. And if she did not sense wrongly, the consciousness core that rose up and was engaged in a fierce battle with Grimm's soul extended from here. Mary did not dare to release her consciousness out of her body, and she did not dare to use her spiritual perception to scan her surroundings. She fully utilized the characteristics of her bat demon transformation, and she concealed herself along the way. She carefully probed along the way, and finally climbed along the long corridor into a tall and majestic witchcraft hall. This place might have been the core hall of Cothran Castle. The central platform was densely packed with crystal clusters, and a black light ball with a diameter of 10 meters floated on top of it. It was connected to the various areas of the castle through a dark and deep magical light belt. And on the surface of the black ball, there were hundreds of strange magical images, all of which were real-time images from various parts of the Nightmare Castle. Among them, the battle scenes in front of the castle were the most numerous, occupying more than 70% of the magic images. At this moment, there was a hazy and illusory human figure standing in front of the central platform. He looked up at the constantly changing image on the black ball, his hands moving as if they were dancing. Under his control, the attacks and defenses of the castle, as well as the circulation of the tremendous life energy, were all so orderly. Although the humanoid silhouette was illusory, there was an exceptionally bright halo flashing on its chest, faintly emitting the unique soul fluctuations of a living being. Kathleen's soul core. Mary was so excited that she wanted to climb over the dome. But just as she thought about it, that strange voice appeared in her mind. Be careful, that figure is a fake. This place is full of witchcraft traps. Don't go near it. Mary's body trembled slightly, and she immediately stopped in her tracks. She was so far away, and she couldn't take the initiative to sense the other party's soul aura. Thus, it wasn't easy to determine whether he was real or fake. But along the way, the voice in her mind had helped her a lot, so Mary chose to believe it without hesitation. Then what should I do? I don't have much time. Mary asked in her mind, Alice, if you know what to do, just tell me directly. Don't pretend to be a ghost to deceive me. The voice in her mind paused for a moment, and finally replaced the neutral and low voice with Alice's sweet and clear voice. Hee, I'm afraid that you'll hesitate whether I'll harm you or not. I don't know whether you'll harm me or not, but I only need to know that you won't harm Grimm. So, I believe you, Mary said resolutely. Alice paused for a moment, then sighed and said, I don't know who will be luckier when you meet Grimm. Ahem, what's next? Mary didn't want to think about the complicated psychological changes of the other party. She just closed her eyes and listened to her plan quietly. In front of the powerful witches of destiny, no one could keep or hide their secrets. Even the newly born Cothran was the same. As long as she wanted to, there was no secret that she couldn't find out. The only difference was whether she was willing to pay a high price to obtain these secrets. With Alice as a cheat, Mary, who had transformed into a petite bat, had the help of God. She shuttled through the dense witchcraft traps and psionic threads. Her target was no longer the shadowy figure in the middle of the hall, but a small secret room that was hidden by a tall pillar behind the hall. The small secret room was only a dozen square meters in size, and the furnishings inside were extremely simple. There was only a table and a chair. Wizard Freud, who had been missing for a long time, sat silently on the wooden chair. A pitch-black dagger was stuck in his head. His eyes were white, his body was trembling, and his mouth was involuntarily letting out hoarse howls. Obviously, Catherine and Freud were still in the midst of an intense soul fusion. If it wasn't for the fact that she wanted to obtain the complete knowledge and memories of Freud's soul, this soul war would have ended long ago. Mary carefully crawled to the door of the secret room, but she was blocked by a thin energy barrier. Although the barrier was thin, it had an extremely shocking amount of energy. For an assassin like Mary, who mainly relied on agility, it was rather difficult for her to break it in one blow. With it blocking the door, it was impossible for Mary to sneak in without a sound. Just when Mary was at her wit's end, Alice's voice sounded again. "Get ready. I've already communicated with Grimm. He will launch his most powerful attack in 7 seconds. That attack would activate the Nightmare Castle's energy circulation, causing this light membrane to disappear by half a finger. You must make good use of this time. The moment you rush in, use your soul imprint to control him. Understood?" The connection of thoughts was undoubtedly the fastest. Even the most complicated and tangled thoughts could be communicated hundreds or thousands of times in an instant. Therefore, when the attack that shook the entire castle arrived, Mary instantly transformed into her human form and took advantage of the moment the barrier dissipated to rush in. Although her movements were swift, this was Catherine's nightmare weave after all. With the home advantage, the slightest fluctuation of the blood-red energy was detected by Catherine, who was nearby. The witchcraft hall immediately roared with energy, and a terrifying spiritual pressure pushed over like a small mountain, as though it was going to crush the place into pieces. In the secret room, Freud's body suddenly trembled, and he instantly suppressed all the fighting. He raised his head, and 2 balls of dazzling light shone in the depths of his murky yellow eyes. There wasn't much time left for Mary to react. For a top-notch powerhouse like her, a single thought in her mind was something that could be done in an instant. Suddenly encountering an enemy was also an essential part of instinctive defense. There was no need to think or hesitate about these things. Almost the moment Mary leaked her aura, the entire Nightmare Castle and Catherine were ready to launch their counterattack. The energy barrier that had disappeared for a moment due to the aftermath of the battle affecting the energy transmission appeared once again. It spread out from the wall at the door and quickly closed up toward the center. Perhaps in just half an instant, they would be able to seal the door of the secret room again. By then, the only way for the invaders to attack Catherine was to first break this energy barrier. Unfortunately, half an instant was also time. To Mary, who had super agility, the opponent's quick reaction was still a comical slow motion in her eyes. A moment ago, she was still at the door of the secret room, and with a bang, blood-red energy filled the air, transforming from a small bat demon to a normal human form. In the next moment, Mary's blood-red figure had already passed through the door of the secret room and appeared beside Freud. 2 small tornadoes instantly appeared between the two of them, and they turned into terrifying wind vortexes that wrapped around Mary's body. Pieces of wind blades that were as thin as scales and as fast as knives raged on the surface of Mary's body. Even with the blood-red energy protecting her body, Mary's body still had countless small wounds, as though she had been instantly dismembered. The wind vortexes were still spreading, and they wanted to block all of Mary's routes of attack. Freud's idea was very simple. He wanted to use this terrifying spell to force Mary to retreat and try his best to buy himself some time to react. As long as he bent his finger, he could mobilize the powerful power of the castle's core to protect this body, allowing his core consciousness to smoothly escape to the central crystal. Of course, This also meant that he would have to give up this high-level grade 4 wizard soul. And at the same time, it also meant that he would have to give up the chance to break through that terrifying threshold in a short period of time. Although it was a pity, he did not have the slightest bit of hesitation. Thus, he was not willing to experience the pain of having his soul controlled by someone else. Unfortunately, the enemy he faced today, other than the legendary fire wizard who was stirring up trouble outside the castle, there was also a grade 4 super agility blood wizard. However, the one who really decided his fate was the instigator behind the scenes, the leader of the Fate Witches, Alice. Mary did not have the slightest intention of retreating or dodging. She actually withstood the terrifying counterattack of the opponent's instant witchcraft, broke through the strangulation of the wind vortexes, and pounced on Freud's body, viciously biting his neck. At the same time, a strange, dazzling light flowed into Freud's body, and actually forcefully kept the newly born Coslin in this body. No, Freud screamed in shock, and there were obviously two voices in his hoarse roar. Chapter 1330. The battle that took place in Nightmare Weave was just a battle of wills. The battle inside was so intense that it was as if the heavens were falling and the earth was splitting apart, but the outside was still calm and tranquil. When Mary forcefully took control of Nightmare Castle Coslin with the embrace, Grimm's consciousness was immediately repelled by a strong force and was chased out of Nightmare Weave. Grimm and Mary opened their eyes one after the other in the secret room of Nightmare Castle. Grimm frowned, but Mary's face was full of joy. Did you succeed? Grimm knew it was unnecessary to ask the question the moment it left his mouth. There was no need to ask, no need to look at Mary's overflowing joy. He knew the result just by looking at the strange resonance between the depths of her soul and the Nightmare Castle. Yes, the moment she retreated from Nightmare Weave, Mary's soul was connected to the Nightmare Castle beneath her. Strands of blood-red energy flowed. This strange creation that was a combination of alchemy and flesh curled up under Mary's blood-red authority, as docile and obedient as a puppy. The force field that had been suppressing Grimm and Mary also disappeared in an instant. Inside the castle, the powerful blood-red energy replaced the past life energy, becoming the source of power that maintained the huge form and energy system of Nightmare Castle. Why don't you return the energy orb to Coslin? Otherwise, it can only limit its home ground advantage to the inside of the castle. With the energy orb, Nightmare Weave can expand to at least 1,000 meters. When that time comes, everything within 3 miles of Nightmare Castle will be Coslin's home ground. Mary asked impatiently. Although the energy orb was with her, she still had to respect Grimm's opinion on how to use it. It's your pet, you decide. Grimm smiled, indirectly agreeing with Mary's opinion. Mary happily took out the energy ore from her bosom. Waves of blood-red energy immediately lingered around her body, turning into a red pillar with a groove at the top. The moment Mary put the orb in, the red pillar immediately retracted into the floor. A moment later, the Nightmare Castle glowed with a blood-red hue. Layers of energy fields flowed out from the castle's core, pushing out the elements and energy that did not belong to it. In the blink of an eye, layers and layers of densely packed energy fields enveloped the Nightmare Castle once more, turning this place into the new life, Coslin's home field. Grimm estimated that after being controlled by Mary, Coslin had the strength of a grade 4 high rank being. He had not yet reached the level of a forbidden life form. Fred, who had been blood sacrificed, had also become a grade 4 soul bound by Nightmare Castle. Only his strength had fallen to grade 4 low rank. How is it? How does controlling Coslin help you? Due to the presence of the energy field, even Grimm could not directly and clearly investigate Coslin's detailed information, so he could only ask Mary vaguely. It's nothing, just having a grade 4 weave. Mary's smile was like a flower, and she had a proud look on her face. However, if the battlefield is on Coslin's home ground, I also have the confidence to fight against you super experts. Unfortunately, Coslin's Nightmare Castle's mobility was too weak. Hence, Mary could only be a defensive-type weave. Unfortunately, Coslin's Nightmare Castle's mobility was too weak. Hence, Mary could only play the role of a defensive-type weave. Although it was not perfect, Grimm still nodded in satisfaction. With this, the Crimson family's foundation had truly stabilized. Previously, Grimm's appearance had already caused a stunned grenade to fall on the scattered towers. The waves caused by this had yet to subside. Aside from the scattered towers, the surrounding areas, both overt and covert, were also pressuring the Crimson family like an avalanche. This time, the Crimson family had to advance with all their might no matter what. If they couldn't get past this hurdle, the Crimson family would only be left with the path of disintegration under the ravages of the raging storm. As a Tier 4 Magus, Grimm might be able to avoid this, but the other members of the Crimson family would find it difficult to establish themselves in the central continent. Now that Mary had Coslin under her control, her strength had improved by leaps and bounds. In a certain aspect, she could even compete with Weave's strength. This was undoubtedly a stabilizing force for the Crimson family, which was currently in the midst of the storm. They didn't need to fight, they didn't need to bluff. They only needed to leak a bit of information, and it would scare off those with ill intentions. It would also cause the enemies in the dark to not dare to act rashly, and it would save the Crimson family countless troubles. It was precisely because he had seen through this problem so clearly that Grimm suddenly broke into a smile. Then, as a congratulatory gift for obtaining the Nightmare Castle, let's hold a banquet here. In any case, there are quite a number of family representatives who have come over these days. We can meet them all at once. Holding a banquet is a lie. I think you just want to scare those emissaries. All right, let's set the time for tomorrow night. I'll give you a surprise then. Mary snorted, evidently seeing through Grimm's ploy. The two looked at each other and smiled, their faces filled with anticipation. The next day, after nightfall, all the family emissaries who were waiting here received the Crimson family's notice and began to arrive at Cothran Castle one after another. After a few days together, everyone had a new understanding of Cothran Castle. It was obvious that a blood sacrifice had been carried out in the castle not long ago. As the number and quality of magi involved was too terrifying, the entire castle was filled with vengeful spirits and the pungent stench of blood. However, this time, when they arrived in front of the castle on various mounts, they immediately felt a different aura. The vengeful spirits had been swept away, and even the stench of blood had become much thinner, turning into a faint mist that was similar to blood elemental energy. The people who welcomed them in front of the castle gates were none other than the Blood Queen subordinates. The men were scholarly, and the women were charming. All of them were dressed extravagantly, their postures elegant and noble. The entire banquet was organized in an orderly and methodical manner. Apart from the many high-ranked blood kindred, the higher-ups of the Crimson family were also gathered here. Those who showed themselves were the Red Dragon Witch Meryl, the demonic woman Amelia, the Emerald Dragon Beauty Aratina, the Insect Lich Bliss, the Goblin Great Sage Cabby, the Cloning Brainsock, the Goblin Wizard Loke, the Goblin Leader Ganga. After so many years of training and accumulation, most of these Crimson Elders who had followed Grimm for hundreds of years had reached rank 3. As for those who could not keep up with the Crimson family, they were either gradually eliminated or had passed away due to old age. In short, those people would never appear in such an occasion again. However, this was not surprising. What truly made the guests feel bewildered were the attendants who were shuttling back and forth in the banquet hall. None of the emissaries who could attend the Crimson family's banquet were easy to deal with. They had to be at least a rank 2 Magus. The large families might only send one Magus in charge as an emissary, and their rank would not be lower than rank 3. Most of the smaller families might only have 1 or 2 rank 2 magi in their entire family. Thus, they could only obediently let their patriarch act as the emissary and rush over. As a high-ranked Magus, he had naturally seen countless Magus banquets. However, there was no one like the Crimson family who used the souls of high-ranked spirits as their attendants. In the banquet hall, the female attendants who were holding silver trays and shuttling back and forth between the crowd were not humans, nor were they vampires. Instead, they were beautiful, enchanting, and beautiful humanoid women, night fiends. The Dream Demon, also known as the Night Demon, was a strange monster with wings and a tail. Their greatest ability was to absorb the energy of sentient beings through dreams. Thus, in many books on Magus spells, they were drawn out from monsters and undead and classified as spiritual beings. However, no matter how they were classified, they were obviously not intelligent beings. On the contrary, they were extremely dangerous and frightening beings. However, the fact that the Crimson family could tame night fiends and make them serve many magi showed that they had a deep foundation in this area. These night fiends were all frightening rank 2 spirits. If they were placed in a small Magus family, they could easily annihilate their family. However, here, they were just lowly attendants and servants, serving the magi with all their might. However, when these night fiends shuttled back and forth among the crowd, the regular rank 2 magi felt their hearts tremble and their genitals become unstable. They could only stealthily cast some defensive spells on themselves and carefully distance themselves from these nightmare demons. The rank 2 magi were only lamenting about these insignificant things. However, the rank 3 magi had a deeper and more direct feeling than them. The outstanding rank 3 magi already had the qualifications to conduct research on laws. Although they were still unable to touch and control laws, they could still use some spells to simulate the effects of laws. Thus, while the rank 2 magi were making a fuss about the Nightmare Maidens, the rank 3 magi were quietly sizing up the Kessling Castle in front of them. Strange, bizarre. They did not know why, but it felt different from a few days ago. This Kessling Castle in front of them seemed to have undergone some strange changes. The faint aura that leaked out was completely unfamiliar, causing them to be unable to grasp it. Was it their senses that were wrong, or was there really something strange about this Kessling Castle? However, just as they were feeling bewildered, the main character of today's banquet, the Blood Queen Mary, appeared in front of them wearing a bright red dress as she stepped on the creaking stairs. Once she appeared, the expressions on everyone's faces changed from bewilderment to shock. They can no longer hide it. Chapter 1331. In fact, Mary did not appear alone. As the head of the Crimson family, Grimm wore an exquisite black robe, holding hands as he made a grand entrance with Mary. Unfortunately, even with Grimm's tall and sturdy body and his reputation as a legendary fire magus, he could not overshadow Mary's flamboyant and powerful aura that seemed to be burning her life force. Indeed, at this moment, the sole aura that rose from Mary's body resonated with the entire Nightmare Castle. The powers of both sides intertwined and mixed together, becoming more and more intense and sonorous. It was like an impassioned symphony, deeply dominating and shaking the minds of all the sorcerers present. It was because Mary's brilliance was too dazzling that Grimm, who accompanied her, was unwittingly ignored by the crowd. Their entire field of vision was filled with a beautiful woman with an arrogant expression. Mary, it was the Blood Queen Mary. Since when did she become so powerful? Mary was the second in command of the Crimson family, and also a powerful rank 4 magus. However, for a long time, her brilliance had been overshadowed by Grimm's arrogance. Moreover, the Magi of the Central Continent were obviously weaker than the Magi, so their status and identity were always looked down upon. However, with Mary's appearance today, the powerful aura and spiritual pressure that could almost control the heartbeat and mental strength of all the Magi present had left an indelible impression in their hearts. Welcome, everyone. Mary's smile became even more radiant, but her words were obviously not directed at the people present. Just as everyone was feeling puzzled, a ray of light shone from the darkness in the distance. A figure with an imposing aura appeared, accompanied by a deep and resounding voice. "Congratulations, Magus Mary. Congratulations, Lord Grimm." A short, stocky, middle-aged man walked out from the darkness. He had a full beard and was bald, with 3 strands of hair that were half black and half white at the back of his head. He was not wearing a magus robe, but rather an old gray leather armor. Not a single piece of magic equipment could be seen on his body. The moment this man appeared, a few gasps sounded in the hall. Lord Declan. It's Declan from the Fabris family. Everyone's expressions tensed up, and they hurriedly lowered their gazes, bowing in unison. This was their instinctive respect and fear towards Tier 4 wizards. In the face of a Tier 4 sorcerer low, and mid-tier sorcerers like them found it hard to breathe. I heard that you defeated Freed, so I came here to take a look. Declan looked up at Mary, who was surrounded by a force field that had almost merged with the castle behind her. He couldn't help but reveal a surprised expression. It seems that you have gained a lot from this battle. Congratulations, Lady Mary, he said with a sigh. The sorcerer world had always been divided by strength. At this moment, Mary had the blessing of the entire castle, and her strength had long since leaped above him. Because of that, Declan immediately made his stand clear. Even the way he addressed Mary changed subtly. She waved her hand, and a black and red carpet suddenly appeared, stretching from Declan's feet to the entrance of the castle hall. The sorcerers present gasped in admiration at this terrifying method of instantaneous materialization of energy. Declan sighed silently. He stepped on the soft and clean carpet and slowly walked toward the two of them. Even though they had become allies, Declan was not willing to get within 10 meters of the two of them. Even for Tier 4 magi like them, a distance of 10 meters was too close. Many of them would feel nervous if they got too close. For some reason, the closer he got to Mary, the more Declan's spiritual perception was suppressed. Once he was 10 meters away from the two of them, Declan was not willing to take another step forward. He had a feeling that if he took another step forward, he would trigger a terrifying and unpredictable counterattack. Just as the three of them warmly greeted each other, Mary turned her gaze towards the darkness in the distance once more. Another guest has arrived. Grim and Declan could not help but laugh bitterly in their hearts. They had no choice. As long as they were within the vicinity of the Nightmare Castle, their spiritual perception would be affected by the powerful force field. Their vision was not as clear as Mary's. I'm not late this time, am I? I didn't expect you to be ahead of me, Declan. A hoarse female voice sounded. Clara, who had not been seen for a long time, slowly walked out of the darkness and arrived before the group. You're so beautiful. Clara scrutinized Mary, her face filled with envy and nostalgia. She said in disappointment, I missed the time when I just advanced to grade 4. That was probably the most memorable period of my life. Mary was obviously a person who was easy to get along with. Since the other party was speaking softly and had a humble attitude, she naturally wouldn't be overbearing and keep him at arm's length. The invisible force field that was suppressing the 2 grade 4 magi weakened by almost half. Mary even pulled Clara to her side and began to chat with her with a light smile. This was undoubtedly a form of attitude. It showed that Clara's position in Mary's heart was much higher than Declan's. This undoubtedly allowed Clara, who had a grudge in her heart, to heave a sigh of relief. Since all of you are here, how can I miss out? A red light flashed in the distance, and a tall figure appeared before the group. So it's City Lord Alfred. Welcome, welcome. Grimm's expression relaxed, and a warm smile appeared on his face. Due to the need for benefits, Molten City and the Crimson family have been living in harmony for the past 200 years. As a result, the friendship between Molten City and Grimm grew stronger day by day. However, in the face of powerful benefits and greed, their friendship was only an excuse to maintain a superficial harmony. Despite this, Grimm still welcomed Alfred's arrival with open arms. After all, his appearance meant that the Crimson family had a heavy weight to weigh down on them. 5 grade 4 magi were a frightening group that could not be underestimated. This was especially true in the central continent, where the morale of the people was low. The combined might of Grimm's group could even suppress all opposition. If those who opposed the Crimson Fleet had enough courage and guts, Frid wouldn't have been the only one who appeared in Cothrenburg when the Crimson Fleet attacked the Enum family. Schemes, weighing the pros and cons, observing, hesitating, cowering, the scattered tower forest was just as the three great Magus organizations had said. It was a pile of loose sand. Even though Grimm had forced them to such a state, they still hesitated and pondered. As a result, they watched the Crimson family forcefully swallow Fort Cothran. The moment the Crimson Fleet set off, Grimm had already mentally prepared himself for his base to be ambushed and the Alobes region to be invaded. He had only brought 7 airships with him, leaving 3 behind to guard the family's headquarters against enemy invasions. No matter what, no matter the price, Alfred, the leader of the Crimson family, had to be killed. Even if the Alobes region became a wasteland, he would not hesitate. As long as the Crimson family could protect the few regions that they cared about, losing the rest did not matter. When the Crimson Fleet returned in triumph, they would have to return all the territories that had been taken by their enemies. At that time, it would be time for the Crimson family to settle the score with them. However, what surprised Grimm was that Merva, who had been purposely left behind by the Crimson Fleet, did not move at all. He did not take the opportunity to attack the Crimson family's base, nor did he come to support Alfred. It was as if this war had nothing to do with him. This was what surprised Grimm the most. However, after carefully reviewing the information on Merva, Grimm could roughly understand his motive. Merva did not have much time left. If Alfred had less than 200 years left, then Merva had less than 100 years left. 100 years. It sounded like a long time, but for a high-ranked Magus, it was only the time for 1 or 2 large-scale experiments. Once Merva passed away, the Enemder Academy that he presided over would become the target of public criticism. At least, Grimm had never heard of an outstanding successor to the Enemder Academy. That necromancer Dante seemed to have suffered a heavy blow in the semifinals, and there had been no news of him since. Who knew if Merva would nurture him before he died? If Dante could not successfully grow into a Grade 4 Magus, the Enemder Academy would probably have to withdraw from the ranks of Grade 4 organizations in a short period of time. This was actually the norm in the scattered tower forest. Although the central continent was rich in resources, densely populated, and vast territories, the Magi Order was based on families and bloodlines. Too many resources were given to the Magi who were not particularly talented, but were the descendants of their families. As for the Magi with the title of genius, if they did not have any background and did not choose to rely on any Magus family, the process of gathering knowledge and resources was extremely difficult and sad. Caught in the cracks between Magus families of all sizes, they could only run around to search for resources and gather knowledge. Even so, they were often bullied and exploited by various Magus families. Chapter 1332. Those who could appear here today could be considered allies of the Crimson family. The fact that Declan, Clara, and Alfred had come together had undoubtedly given the Crimson family a lot of face. Hence, Grimm and Mary had invited them warmly, and the 5 of them were about to enter Nightmare Castle to begin the feast. However, before they could move, the 5 of them froze and turned to look into the distance. Unexpectedly, there were still guests arriving. A crystal airship that resembled a stingray flew out of the darkness and hovered above the gray stone plaza of Nightmare Castle, following which 2 figures of different heights appeared before them and slowly floated to the ground. It's Tardas and Monali. They're both members of the Silver Alliance's council. Don't underestimate Tardas just because he's a midget. His uncle is one of the few super powerful beings in the Alliance. Clara clearly recognized the 2 fellows who had just appeared and hurriedly introduced them to Grimm and Mary through voice transmission. 2 rank 4 Magi, Grimm could not help but feel his heart skip a beat. No matter how much the Silver Alliance valued the Central Continent, stationing a rank 4 Magus here was already a clear indication of their attitude. Now, however, 2 of them had appeared at the same time. Grimm would never believe that the Silver Alliance did not covet the scattered forest of towers. Moreover, Alice had told him that Fred had come into contact with a large Magus organization some time ago. Although the details were vague, it was highly likely that Fred had chosen to come into contact with the Silver Alliance. Now, the Crimson family had just defeated the Enum family, and now 2 rank 4 magi from the Silver Alliance had appeared. Even a ghost would not believe that there was nothing fishy going on here. As the head of the Crimson family, it was naturally Grimm's duty to entertain guests. Grimm revealed a warm smile and spread out his hands, taking a step forward. Welcome, welcome. Everyone who can come to Nightmare Castle tonight is a friend of the Crimson family. Since 2 esteemed guests are here, why not come in and have a chat? Tardes was a midget that was less than 3 meters tall. He was short, and his robes were a little too long. He looked somewhat wretched and crafty. Monali was also of a different race. He had a male body and an eagle's head on his neck. The former was a puppet master, while the latter was a puppeteer. Puppeteer had an incomparably powerful battle magic armor, which he could wear on his body like a suit of armor to fight his enemies. Puppeteers, on the other hand, were experts in manipulating puppets and would always carry a large number of battle puppets with them. These 2 professions were also the combat professions with the most people in the Silver Alliance. In response to Grimm's warm invitation, Tatas was the first to speak with a pair of mung-bean eyes. We came here to see that Fred, but we didn't expect to see him. I didn't expect you to act so quickly and take care of him first. Then we have no choice but to look for you. The other Monali was much calmer and more experienced than Tardes. He spoke with a thick accent. We've heard a lot about what Sir Grimm has done recently. To tell the truth, personally, I admire you very much, Your Excellency. But since Your Excellency has defeated Fred, there are some questions that require Your Excellency to answer. The 2 of them were indeed members of the Silver Alliance. Even though they were in the middle of the continent, the arrogance and disrespect in their words were not concealed. Guests from afar, there's no need to talk outside. Why don't we sit down and slowly discuss these questions? Please. Grimm's eyes flickered with a cold glint as he passionately led them into the Nightmare Castle. As soon as they stepped into the castle, not to mention Tatas and Monali who had come from afar, even the Magi of the Central Continent, Alfred, Clara, and Declan, had a slight change in expression. There was no other reason other than the fact that this ancient castle actually possessed an astonishingly powerful force field defense. Upon entering, the few Magi who were constantly probing their surroundings were actually suppressed back into their bodies. In this place, all the extrinsic spiritual energy was cut off, and all the probing methods of witchcraft were forbidden. They were beaten back to their original state, becoming mortals who could only see, hear, and smell with their eyes, ears, and nose. Without his spiritual perception, it meant that he could not see everything clearly like before. Without spiritual force, if something bad happened around them, they would lose the psychological advantage of being able to foresee it. This kind of terrifying situation where they were completely blinded caused everyone to feel slightly uneasy. After all, as Magi, they had never placed their lives in the hands of a stranger before. Tatas and Monali looked at each other in shock, a trace of understanding appearing in their eyes. This seemed to be the home field of the Blood Queen Mary. If they fought here, their spiritual force would be suppressed to an extremely low level, while Mary would have the advantage of being in her home field. The increase and decrease in combat strength brought about by this was extremely frightening. In truth, before coming here, the only person in the Crimson family that could catch their attention was the legendary Fire Shaman Grimm. As for the others, they were just mediocre people. However, the moment they stepped into Mary's home field, the expressions of the 2 Silver Alliance members turned extremely ugly. For the first time, they began to worry about this mission. After the few Magi entered the 3rd floor of the Nightmare Castle hand in hand, the Magi, who had been suppressed for a long time, finally heaved a sigh of relief. They gathered together and began to discuss in low voices. A gathering of 7 rank 4 Magi was definitely a rare occasion in the Central Continent. The fact that they were gathered together indicated that something big was about to happen in the Central Continent. What was it? The appearance of a fourth Magus organization. Or is it something else? The reason why so many envoys from the various families had gathered here was to assess the situation and occupy the most advantageous position in the central continent. Now that the architects of the current situation had gathered together, what would they discuss? Would the negotiations go smoothly? Every single one of these questions was troubling their hearts. However, it was a pity that although they had the numbers, there was no lack of envoys from large Magus families. Here, however, they could only wait patiently, waiting for the big shots to come to a conclusion before announcing the news. The discussion in the Nightmare Castle had already begun. When the 7 Magi were seated on the 3rd floor, in the pitch-black night sky outside the castle, an exceptionally majestic giant eagle was silently circling in the air. The giant eagle's body was abnormally large, 6 to 7 times the size of a normal mountain eagle. Its feathers were soft yet tough, and their surface flickered with a metallic luster. Its scarlet eyes constantly scanned the area below, and its eyeballs flickered with the light of the soul, which was unique to intelligent creatures. Seeing that the few people who were pursuing it had already entered the castle, and that the situation inside could not be spied on due to the interference of a powerful force field, the giant eagle could not help but let out a long cry. Its pair of large wings flapped, and it quickly flew towards the southwest. As it flapped its wings, a single feather that had fallen off drifted in the chilly night breeze, circling and drifting in the air. After all, it was only an ordinary feather, and there was no magical glow on it. Hence, it did not attract the attention of the many magi below. Finally, it floated down from the sky and landed on a small mound 5 miles west of the castle. Just as the feather was about to hit the ground, a strange human figure wearing a strange robe suddenly appeared and gently pinched it. This was a middle-aged man with a resolute and calm expression. He wore an insignia with a scroll and a feather pen on his chest, and there was a strange magic rune in the middle of his forehead. He gently twirled the feather and brought it to his nose to sniff it. A strange information that only a scroll scholar could decipher flowed into his mind. Central Continent Gathering. Forbidden life form. Enter the castle to investigate. This was an investigation mission personally issued by the Tower Master. He was asked to immediately infiltrate the castle and investigate the secret agreement reached by a few magi. In the meantime, he also had to investigate the information about the forbidden life form. The scroll scholars had always adhered to the basic principle of not getting involved in the world, not interfering, and not explaining. They were only servants of fate, like eyes independent of the entire human race. They were only responsible for observing and recording all major events that happened in the Magus world, but they did not get involved. It was precisely because of this principle that the scroll scholars were not jointly suppressed by other Magus organizations. However, this did not mean that the high-ranked magi would like them. No one liked to have a group of bored fellows secretly holding a feather pen and recording their every move while they were doing their work. Even if they were harmless, they would still be extremely unhappy. The mission to infiltrate the castle this time was obviously even more overboard. The secret agreement and the forbidden life form. Either one of them was a deep secret of the Crimson family. It would not be easily leaked out. However, the Tower Master wanted him to infiltrate and find out the truth. He knew that this mission was extremely difficult, but the scroll scholar did not show any signs of retreating. After he finished deciphering the information on the feather, he waved it lightly, and the feather rapidly combusted. After the feather was completely burnt, the scroll scholar's robe shook, and his entire body seemed to become invisible as he slowly disappeared into the air. There were no magic undulations, and no signs of life leaked out. A completely transparent and strange human figure quickly ran towards the castle in the distance like a ghost. 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. Chapter 1333. In the meeting hall, Mary furrowed her brows. "What's wrong?" Grim, who was connected to her mind, asked in a low voice. There seems to be a small bug in the castle. It's quite troublesome. Be careful. If it's a spy sent by other Magus organizations, just kill him. If it's one of those scroll scholars, just chase him out. These few days, there would be some inexplicable fellows burrowing into the castle, and Mary was about to be annoyed to death. It had to be said that the scroll scholars were a neutral organization that dissociated themselves from all Magus organizations, and were basically harmless. However, it was not a good idea to let a small bug burrow in front of one's eyes, which was why Grimm suggested banishing them. After all, killing a dossier scholar was likely to anger the Prophet's Tower that he represented. If this organization that controlled all the secrets of the Magus world for the past tens of thousands of years were forced to the opposite side, no Magus or organization would be able to withstand their ferocious counterattack. Hence, even if high-ranked Magi hated these fellows who liked to pry into the privacy of individuals or organizations, they still did not dare to kill them. There was no other reason than the omniscient eye that stood behind them, representing the power of surveillance. According to some Magi who had some insider information, the omniscient eye was very likely a projection of the Magus world's power of destiny. Through it, one could secretly understand and investigate the secrets behind the Magus world's operations. With such a large group of Magi, there would naturally be a group of people who did not like fighting and killing, nor did they like worldly power. They only liked to quietly research and investigate the truth of the world. Hence, this group of people shouted slogans that did not enter the world, did not interfere, and did not explain. They crowded around the omniscient eye and were busy all day, using the operation of the power of destiny to pry into the power of the world's high-level laws. As they were too close to the omniscient eye, they had already unknowingly exchanged power with the power of destiny. The omniscient eye allowed them to get close to him and track the operation of the power of destiny. They were also strictly forbidden from publicizing their research and knowledge, and could only store it in the towering Prophet's Tower. Hence, in all seriousness, the scroll scholars were a group of servants bound by the omniscient eye. But they always thought that they controlled the power of destiny. Although the Magi of the world saw them as a bunch of lunatics, the long period of contact with the law of destiny had given them powerful and bizarre Magi abilities. Their ability to conceal themselves and their methods were different from other Magi of the elemental system. They could be considered a mysterious force that was completely independent of the Magi system. The negotiations in the secret room continued. Other than Mary, who was slightly distracted, the rest of the sorcerers had a serious look on their faces. The arena was clearly divided into two factions, the Scattered Towers and the Silver Alliance. Even though the Tier 4 sorcerers of the Central Continent were usually in a state of disunity, the moment the three great sorcerer organizations decided to dip their hands into the Scattered Tower Forest, it would instantly inspire them to unite against a common enemy. The internal strife of the Scattered Tower Forest was considered a civil war. No matter how brutal the fighting was, the meat would always rot in one's own pot, and no one else would take advantage of it. However, once the three major organizations extended their hands in, it would be extremely difficult to expel them. Thus, in today's secret room discussion, the atmosphere suddenly became scorching hot the moment both sides sat down. As expected, Tardas and Monali, who came here, held a secret agreement signed by Freed, agreeing to let the Silver Alliance enter his private territory and build a large public city here. On the surface, the so-called public city would naturally be open to all forces and organizations. However, everyone present knew that the true authority of such a public city would most likely fall into the hands of the Silver Alliance. This was obviously a little overstepping their boundaries. In the past, the Scattered Tower Forest allowed members of the Silver Alliance to engage in commercial activities, establish small strongholds, and own appropriate private territory. However, the construction of a true Magus Tower was strictly prohibited. As long as there were no Magus Towers belonging to the Silver Alliance in the Scattered Tower Forest, they would not be able to truly take root here, and there would be no possibility for them to develop and grow. Although many megacities in the central continent would hire some members of the Silver Alliance to manage them, the management authority of the Magus Tower, which was the core of the central continent, was always firmly in the hands of the Magi of the central continent. For example, the Silver Alliance was in charge of the airship business that traveled to and from the central continent. However, they only had the authority to transport goods and people, and could not have any fixed anchorage. This was the iron law of the scattered tower forest, and also the bottom line. However, this secret agreement with Fred's signature obviously broke this iron law. Not only did it allow the Silver Alliance to build a so-called public city in their territory, it also gave them the actual control of the most important wizard's pagoda. It was no wonder that after Clara, Alfred, and Declan understood the contents of the agreement, their faces turned ashen. They had already cursed the dead Fred in their hearts, and cursed all the women in his family. Only Grimm's expression did not change after reading the agreement. Instead, a mischievous smile appeared on his face. Since this agreement was signed by Fred, you naturally have to look for him to fulfill it. Why are you looking for me now? This agreement was undoubtedly not complete. The real content should be that Fred had reached an agreement with the Silver Alliance, in which the Silver Alliance would send troops to help him defend against the Crimson family's invasion. And he would sell out the interests of the scattered tower forest, secretly transferring part of his territory's authority to the Silver Alliance. However, this content could not be announced, and could only be carried out in the name of cooperating to develop a public city. Furthermore, from the terms of the agreement, it could be seen that old Fred had already sold out Cothran Castle to the Silver Alliance. The two of them had come from afar today to take over Cothran Castle according to the agreement. Take over Cothran Castle. Hearing this sensitive term, Mary instantly shifted her mental energy back. She looked at the two members of the Alliance with a much fiercer gaze. Sensing Mary's intentions, the energy field in the secret room suddenly fluctuated intensely. Waves of blood-colored energy tangled together, condensing into tiny energy nodes that could not be seen by the naked eye. With these energy nodes as the center, a powerful and terrifying pressure of the energy field acted on the bodies of the two members of the Alliance as expected. It caused their bodies to turn cold and their minds to tremble. They could feel the malicious intent of this world towards them. The expressions of the two members of the Alliance changed slightly, and they began to quietly prepare for battle. The half-blood dwarf Tatas was still smiling, but the surface of his body that was covered by his robe slowly lit up with a faint silver radiance, and it flickered along with his breathing. On the crystal airship 3 miles away, a tall and majestic metal puppet's eye sockets suddenly lit up with a red glow, and then the intricate magic patterns etched on its body lit up one by one. The mental connection between Tatas and the puppet could not be completely cut off by the force field of the ancient castle. When necessary, Tatas only needed 3 fingers to position himself, and he could teleport his demon puppet armor to his side. Monali, who had an eagle's head and a human's body, was also holding a few small and exquisite silver figurines in his robe. If there was a need to fight, he only needed to throw out these miniaturized puppets, and they could transform into tall and terrifying battle puppets in half a finger. Therefore, even though they were on Mary's home ground, the two members of the Silver Alliance still maintained a calm judgment and strong confidence. However, when Mary's blood-red eyes lit up, this confidence vanished into thin air. When Mary sneered, and the blood mist around her dispersed, the magical force field of the entire Nightmare Castle and the witchcraft aura on her body became one. The entire space was suddenly separated from the sorcerer world, and all the witchcraft connection between the castle and the outside was completely cut off. Without the guidance of the soul aura, the demon puppet armor on the crystal airship suddenly dimmed. Tatas' expression changed drastically, and his eyes were filled with uncontrollable fear as he looked at Mary. He was a puppet master, and his body's quality was not outstanding. 80% of his combat power was pinned on the demon puppet armor that was forged with countless rare materials and resources. If the soul connection between him and the demon puppet armor was cut off, his basic combat power would plummet, and he would only be comparable to an elementary grade form magus. Moreover, he did not have many elemental spells, a strong physique, a majestic divine force, or a ghost-like elementary grade form magus. In comparison, Monali, who was a puppet master, was not affected by the changes in the environment. However, in such an enclosed environment, it was not a wise move to fight against a close combat magus with extraordinary agility, spatial awareness, and combat power. Seeing that both sides were at daggers drawn, and it looked like they would start a fight at the slightest disagreement, Grimm smiled and patted the back of Mary's right hand a few times. He said gently, "I think the two magi will not be unreasonable. Why don't we sit down and listen to what they have to say first?" Only Grimm could easily control the Blood Queen Mary, who was usually unmoved by force or persuasion. Her blood-red eyes swept over the two magi from the Alliance, and she said in a fierce voice, "There is no Kirin Castle now, only my nightmare castle. Whoever dares to have any ideas about it is going against me. Don't blame me for turning against you." After saying this, Mary's aura gradually calmed down, and the force field that was suppressing them with the help of the nightmare domain slowly dissipated. Chapter 1334. Negotiations were always difficult and long. The result of a negotiation would only be determined by the absolute power of both parties. It had to be said that Mary's stunning performance had given the Crimson family another bargaining chip. It also made those who thought they knew the Crimson family's background feel lost and hopeless. Unexpected, truly unexpected. Apart from Grimm, the Crimson family's patriarch who had two divine weapons and battle prowess comparable to a supreme being, there was also the equally stunning Blood Queen Mary. Although the combination of Mary and Nightmare Castle could not compare to a true supreme being, they could use their home advantage to display power that was not inferior to that of a supreme being. With such a combination, they could barely be considered as a super powerhouse with defensive abilities. This also meant that a small sorcerer family in the middle of the continent actually had two terrifying sorcerers who were at the level of pseudo-superpowerhouses. With such absolute power, even the three major Magus organizations had to be cautious and consider if they should improve their relationship with the Crimson family, let alone the Magus families in the Central Continent. When numbers accumulated to a certain extent, it would cause a qualitative change. When the Crimson family only had Grimm, who was a pseudo-super being, it was difficult for him to do anything alone. Due to the lack of power, the three major Magus organizations could only rely on their own strength to suppress him. However, when the number of pseudo-super beings increased to two, the advantage of the three major Magus organizations in terms of numbers was no longer as obvious. It was no longer realistic to think that they could casually send a supreme being to silence the Central Continent. What happened to the cursed wizard Savorius might have been interpreted as an accident by some people, but after Mary's rise, those who usually looked down on the Central Continent would have to think twice about the consequences of their actions if they wanted to show off in the Central Continent. After all, Savorius returned to the Magus Association and did not show his face again. It was said that his injuries were very serious, and it would be difficult to completely get rid of the strange laws that had invaded his body without a few years of recuperation. On the other hand, Grimm only took a month to stand up again. Just from this point alone, Grimm had surpassed Savorius and became a powerful magus that could not be underestimated. In the entire sorcerer world, there were less than 10 super powerhouses, and they were scattered among the three major sorcerer organizations. In the past, there was only the leader of the Golden Clan, Monash. Gaia could barely reach this level. Now, Grimm and Mary, these two super powerful magi, had suddenly appeared. This would undoubtedly have a huge impact on the power structure of the Magus world. To put it bluntly, even if Grimm and Mary had nothing now, They could rely on their identity and strength as pseudo-super beings to take root and develop in the central continent that lacked power. The three great wizard organizations could no longer suppress them. After all, in the Magus world, power represented authority, and absolute power represented absolute authority. Even a huge organization like the Sorcerer Association would not be able to suppress two super powerhouses who had teamed up. Therefore, when Mary revealed her true power, it was not only Tardes and Monali who were conquered, but also Clara, Alfred, and Declan who were bystanders. Super beings were super beings after all. Even if they were fake, they still had the terrifying power to crush grade 4 magi. Tardes and Monali, who came with sincerity, immediately stood up and said goodbye. Due to the lag and error in their intelligence, not only did they return empty-handed, but they were also frightened. They did not get what they promised in Fort Cothran and the agreement. They only brought back terrible news to the Alliance headquarters, a news that no one wanted to hear. As for whether they would be enemies or friends in the future, whether they would improve their relationship amicably or fight against each other, it was not something that the two little counselors, who had a lowly position, could control. After sending off the two counselors, Clara and the others began to discuss their future plans behind closed doors. Clara and the others' attitude towards Grimm and Mary became more modest and gentle. In the past, no matter how strong Grimm was, he was not as strong as Monash. Gaia restrained him. If he really wanted to unify the central continent, he would need the powerful assistance of these people. Therefore, be it in terms of status or mentality, Clara and the others still did not put down their dignity as grade 4 magi. They always considered themselves as allies of the Crimson family. But now, with the appearance of Mary, Monash, and Gaia obviously could not suppress the two of them. Therefore, the power structure of the central continent was seriously unbalanced. The Crimson family's dominance was unstoppable. Under such circumstances, the value of these grade 4 magi was not as important as they thought. If they did not lower their pride, there would be no place for them in the central continent in the future. Perhaps there was a trace of sadness and melancholy in the depths of their hearts. They hated themselves for being in the same generation as these two monsters, but they felt a trace of happiness from the bottom of their hearts. Because of various reasons, they did not fall out with the Crimson family to the point of no return. Compared to them, Merva, Nicholas, and Matthew, who were hiding in their nests, should be in even more pain. Compared to them, Merva, Nicholas, and Matthew, who were hiding in their nests, should be in even more pain. When the news of Mary's increase in strength reached their ears, how desperate and indecisive would their hearts be? There was no need to see this with their own eyes. Everyone present could easily imagine it. The families they belonged to were ancient families that had existed in the central continent for thousands of years. They also had close relationships with each other, both in the open and in the dark. But now, because of their wrong decision, they might be chased out of the scattered tower forest and have to fight for food in someone else's territory. Even just thinking about this cruel reality in their minds would make Clara and the others feel terrified and secretly afraid. Getting rid of Fred and destroying the Intim family was more than enough to intimidate them. When the rebels heard the real news, they would definitely not gather together and fight to the death. At their level, their own lives were more important than anything else. They were even more important than their families. It was impossible for grade 4 magi like them to give up their lives for their families. Clara could even imagine that when the Magi families that opposed the Crimson family heard that there were two pseudo-super beings in the Crimson family, they would definitely panic and despair. They could either escape or surrender. There was no third choice. Gather together and fight against them? The Intim family's fate was the most bloody reality. In their hearts, they might still want to maintain their past glory and freedom, but when the path of pursuing these two things might be life-threatening, they would only suppress their desires and not fight to the death for them. This was the true nature of the Central Continent's grade 4 magi. The so-called secret room meeting was more accurately a demonstration of Mary's power. When everyone personally experienced the terrifying power of the combination of Nightmare Castle and Mary, there was no longer any suspense as to who would emerge victorious in the Central Continent. After a brief discussion on acceptable surrender terms, Clara and the others set out for the various Tier 4 powers that were still hesitating and observing the situation. There was no need for empty words or threats. They only needed to place the bloody reality in front of them. They would naturally know how to choose. They were all magi of the Central Continent, old faces that had existed for hundreds of years. They all had deep connections with each other. With Clara and the other two acting as messengers, it was much easier for the Crimson Fleet to fight their way through the families one by one. There were hundreds and thousands of magi families in the Central Continent, and there were more than a dozen Grade 4 organizations. If they really fought, it would be impossible to get rid of these obstacles without at least a decade. Moreover, it would be impossible to combine their powers into a single force without several decades of effort. Hence, even if he was confident that he could crush these stubborn people, Grimm still leaned towards peaceful unification. After all, this was the only way to preserve the advantages and essence of the Central Continent and not lose them to internal strife. The reality was just as Clara had predicted. When the Grade 4 organizations they visited heard that the Crimson family's Blood Queen Mary had the strength of a pseudo-superpowerhouse, they finally lowered their arrogant heads and came to an agreement with the Crimson family, investing a portion of their family's power into the newly emerged Horton Sorcerer Academy. The Horton Sorcerer Academy, which had been insignificant a few years ago, rapidly expanded and became the most famous public sorcerer academy in the Central Continent. Powerful teachers, an endless supply of magi resources, a distinctive school design, and the shadow of a super powerhouse silently standing behind the academy. These were all reasons for its success. Moreover, Grimm had promoted the Horton Sorcerer Academy instead of making the Crimson family the only super family in the Central Continent. From his point of view, it was still very fair and just to the various magi families. After all, the Horton Sorcerer Academy opened its doors to all magi and acolytes, and the talents it nurtured would not be forced into the Crimson family. All of these were very beneficial to the magi families that had their own unique characteristics. In the past, they were limited by the aptitude of their acolytes and the lack of resources. Chapter 1335. Anemder Academy. Inside a dark and dim witchcraft room, Merva, who had not shown himself for a long time, was talking to someone through a magic mirror. As the only source of light in the secret room, the magic mirror emitted a gloomy green light. Not only did it not illuminate the space, but it also filled the place with a gloomy atmosphere. The magic mirror was divided into several images, each of which had a strange figure. If one zoomed in, they would be surprised to find that the figures in the images were all famous Grade 4 wizards of the Tower Forest. Every single one of these reputable and honorable fellows was a major figure that could shake the Central Continent with a stomp of their feet. However, at this moment, they were like a group of rats hiding in the sewers, panicking and feeling very upset. At this moment, in a corner of the magic mirror, Matthew, who had sparse hair and swollen eyes, asked in a low voice, "Has this news been verified? Don't tell me it's fake news and wants us to fight amongst ourselves." On the other side of the mirror, Nicholas, who had a gloomy expression and a cold glint in his triangular eyes, said in a low voice, "I just sent Declan away. He's here to persuade me to surrender." Hearing this name, the Magi in the water mirror couldn't help but curse. Declan, this bastard really has no balls. He must be under Grimm's control. That's why he said that. Don't take his words seriously. In the secret room, Merva said in a bitter voice, "The one who came to find me is Alfred." The people in the water mirror fell silent and turned their gazes to Merva. What did Alfred say? Alfred, and you have a good personal relationship. Did he say the same thing? Hearing the questions, Merva's expression became even more bitter. This is no longer a rumor, it's the truth. It said that Clara, Declan, and Alfred were not the only ones who experienced Mary's nightmare weave. Tatas and the other two counselors of the Alliance were also there. How powerful is it? Merva took a deep breath and said, "It's enough to fight against super powerful beings, let alone normal wizards like us." The secret room suddenly became silent. Everyone lost interest in talking, and the atmosphere became abnormally oppressive. After a while, Wizard Nicholas finally opened his mouth and asked Merva, "Merva, what do you think we should do next? Fred has been killed. Everyone in the water mirror looked sympathetically at Nicholas. It couldn't be helped. Apart from the Rander family, Nicholas' territory was the closest to the Crimson family's Alovis region. If Grimm wasn't willing to give up, his next target would be either Vice President Merva or Nicholas, who was close to the Tiger's Den. Thus, compared to everyone else, their doom was even more direct and urgent. Although Nicholas's question was vague, everyone understood what he meant. In truth, everyone wanted to know what Vice President Merva, the only person capable of leading them after Guild Leader Fred's demise, would do. Fight or surrender. If everyone was determined to fight to the death with the Crimson family, it would be extremely difficult for Grimm to unify the Central Continent. Don't forget, there was another famous name in the Central Continent, Scattered Forest of Pagodas. Scattered Forest of Pagodas. This directly pointed out the unique distribution of families in the Central Continent. The areas were scattered, and the wizards' pagodas stood in great numbers. There were many wizard families in the Central Continent, and it was normal for them to rise and fall. Whenever a wizard war broke out, no one would care about the change of territory. The wizards only cared about the control of the wizard's pagoda. Some small wizard families were weak, but if they were invaded by other large factions, they only needed to gather their core members to defend the wizard's tower, and they would be able to defend against the attacks of enemies several times their size. If they could not take down the wizard's tower, it would be useless no matter how many territories they occupied. They could not keep attacking the wizard's pagoda forever. Once the army retreated, the power of the wizard's pagoda would radiate out again, and the land and people that were taken away would return to the original owner. They would only lose some resources. Thus, in the Central Continent, it was extremely difficult to truly and completely destroy a wizard family. Without the courage to bite off all their teeth, there was no way they could take down the wizard's pagoda one by one. Even though the Crimson Fleet, led by Grimm, had displayed the ability to take down the wizard's tower in Freed's territory, they had also revealed some shortcomings. If they wanted to take down a wizard's pagoda, they would definitely need high-level wizards, as well as massive weapons of war like floating battleships or magical puppet dragons. Even if they had all these things, the price they would have to pay would be staggering. Thus, if the many level 4 wizards present decided to fight to the death with the Crimson family, even if they were to retreat and defend, it would give Grimm a splitting headache. The Crimson Fleet under Grimm was indeed terrifying, but there were only 3 level 4 wizards in the family who could hold the fort: Grimm, Mary, and Arms. They could not possibly charge at the front and personally lead the fleet to take down the wizard's pagoda one by one, could they? If they were not there, just the Crimson Fleet alone could be defeated by any level 4 wizard present, forcing them to flee pathetically. When that time came, the time it would take for the Crimson family to unify the Central Continent would be extended indefinitely. This way, the group would have the confidence to wait for an opportunity to turn the situation around. They did not believe that the 3 great wizard organizations would sit back and watch as Grimm ravenously devoured the Central Continent, taking a huge piece of meat that he had been drooling over for a long time. One of the most fundamental reasons why the situation was so calm was that the Crimson family had erupted too fiercely, to the point that the 3 great wizard organizations had yet to react. There had been many wizard wars in the Central Continent in the past, but most of them were long and boring, traversing a wide area to directly attack the nest of the other party, ending a wizard war with a single arrow through the heart. To be honest, a wizard war like this had never happened before. Thus, the three great wizard organizations did not expect the situation to develop so quickly after the conflict within the scattered forest of pagodas erupted. As a result, the situation had gotten out of everyone's control right from the start. What decided the outcome of Magus War was not the large number of low-ranked magi, but the few high-ranked magi who were as rare as phoenix feathers and Sheelan horns. At the start of the war, the three great wizard organizations could send powerful fighters to observe the battle, waiting for an opportunity to intervene and change the outcome of the war. This arrangement was enough, or at least they thought it was enough. After all, Grimm had appeared at the Wizard Association the last time. Even though the power he displayed was very strong, it was only comparable to killing a witch. He was still a long way from becoming a powerful fighter. However, what surprised them was that the legendary fire wizard had improved again in just a few years. Not only had he defeated the Golden Titan Monash, but he had also heavily injured the cursed wizard Savorius in a fair fight. This was clearly out of the Wizard Association's expectations. Since Savorius was defeated by the legendary fire warlock Grimm, they could only send more powerful beings to deal with him. However, these fellows were either roaming the depths of the endless sea of stars or doing some extremely important magic experiments in seclusion. Even though the Wizard Association wanted to mobilize them, even if these powerful fighters were willing to give up their current missions and benefits in return, the time and price they had to pay to return from the depths of the endless sea of stars was abnormally huge. If they could not mobilize the powerful fighters, then they would mobilize the army. However, the dangerous and vast dark forest itself was a natural obstacle. It might not be a problem for the Sorcerer Association to use a small teleportation circle to send a few powerhouses over, but it would be impossible for them to send an entire army of sorcerers over. Using the floating airship as a transit, even if they mobilized the troops and arranged the logistics properly, it would take at least 2 months for this to take shape. With the Crimson Fleet's current attack speed, 2 months would be enough to get rid of most of the Die-Hard members and stabilize the situation in the Central Continent. When that time came, what would the Association's army do? Moreover, if they mobilized a large number of the Association's troops, how would the Northern Witches and the Silver Alliance react? With the three forces tangling with each other, just expressing their attitudes and coordinating their stances would probably take up a lot of time. By the time they came to a conclusion, the Central Continent would have already become the Crimson Fleet's world. In short, the Crimson family's hidden strength was too great, so great that once it exploded, even the three great Magus organizations would not be able to react in time. However, the three great Magus organizations were more concerned about what they could gain from this internal strife in the Scattered Tower Forest. In front of the few grade 4 magi of the Central Continent was a choice between life and death. Their eyes flickered, and their expressions were vicious, but they were also filled with grief, anger, and distress. Once upon a time, they were peerless fiends of the Central Continent who could cause the heavens and earth to tremble with a stomp of their feet. However, when they met an even more unreasonable and tyrannical god of death than they were, apart from grief and anger, there was no other way for them to vent their frustrations. Depressed. Yes, all of them were extremely depressed. To put it bluntly, Grimm being able to become a grade 4 Magus at such a young age was all thanks to the combined efforts of everyone present. However, they had been forced into a corner by a junior, and they might even have to bow to him in the future. Chapter 1336. The vast Milky Way flew by quickly, and the dazzling starlight formed a dreary belt of light in the distance. Looking into the distance, his field of vision was filled with a colorful world. Those shining stars seemed to be very close, as if one could reach them if they bent down and stretched out their hands. However, this was all an illusion. Even the nearest star was billions of miles away. If one did not have the ability to travel through space, it would take 1 to 200 years to get close to them by flying alone. The Milky Way was infinite, but the void was not. The vastness and magnificence of the Milky Way was not something that creatures of other planes could imagine, and the depths of the void were full of ups and downs of energy tides and void storms. In order to survive in such a terrifying and harsh environment, it was impossible to do so without an extremely strong physique and extraordinary magic resistance. However, at this moment, a human figure emitting a purple glow emerged from the depths of the Milky Way, flying over against a void hurricane that was equivalent to the power of a Tier 2 spell. The place he wanted to go was a huge mountain range floating in the endless void. The entire mountain range stretched for nearly 1,000 miles, its surface black and hard, covered with tiny metal particles. It was precisely because of the existence of a large amount of metal that this mountain range could withstand the endless void hurricane, struggling at death's door in the depths of the Milky Way. It was obvious that this was the result of a broken plane continent drifting into the Milky Way. Therefore, the material was hard and rich in metal, and it barely survived. However, under the constant erosion of the endless void hurricane, the edge of the mountain range continued to disintegrate and peel off. The gravel and steel rocks that broke away from the mountain range would be instantly thrown into the endless depths of the Milky Way by a burst of energy sparks. The mountain range was still shrinking and collapsing at a speed visible to the naked eye. Perhaps in another 100 years, the 1,000-mile mountain range that had been eroded by a huge plain continent would also disappear without a trace, completely devoured and digested by the Milky Way. In the Milky Way, as long as one was diligent enough, one could always find countless strange objects that had been stripped from the plane worlds. And there was no real garbage that could withstand the erosion of the energy tides. There were always smart people in the world who knew how to make use of the remaining value of the garbage in space. Since the mountain range would only disappear after 100 years, a small tavern that served as a transit point appeared in a valley in the middle of the mountain range. The purple glowing figure was heading straight for the tavern. The purple light flashed across a horizontal space-time turbulence, dodging a few broken rocks that were peeled off from the mountain, withstanding the whistling wind, and slowly landed in the valley. What appeared in front of them was a strange building dug out from the belly of the mountain. The gate was especially tall and huge, so tall that it could even accommodate a giant whale coming in and out. The door of the building seemed to be made of wood, and there were even fine and complicated wood veins on it. However, on the surface of the wooden door, there was a strange-looking magic rune. The magic runes flickered and flickered, releasing strange force field fluctuations in a regular pattern. It also propped up a thin energy light film. It was this energy light film that was as thin as a piece of craft paper that blocked the endless void hurricanes, allowing the two wooden doors to be maintained for a long time. On the wooden signboard above the wooden door, there was a picture of a bubbling wine glass. The purple light landed in front of the tavern, passed through the thin energy light film, and pushed open the two single-leaf wooden doors and strode in. It was a completely different world inside and outside the door. Outside the door was a harsh barren world, while inside the door was a world of bustling and extraordinary hustle and bustle. The two seemingly simple double wooden doors clearly had the powerful effect of separating space and isolating energy aura, which was why the tavern was cleverly and mysteriously hidden in this place. Inside the door was a huge circular space with a few thick stone pillars reaching the dome, supporting the world. Below the dome, a few humans stood behind a row of wooden counters. Judging from their clothes and appearance, they seemed to be the bartenders and waiters of the tavern. There were a dozen or so stone tables in the hall, each of which was surrounded by some oddly shaped fellows who were eating, drinking, and chatting. There weren't many humans among these fellows, and they all had strange skin tones, strange shapes, strange clothes, and strange ways of talking. In a corner of the hall, there were a few extraordinarily large creatures from other planes sitting cross-legged. From their size, one could tell that the tavern's door was built so tall, and it was obviously prepared for them. The food on the stone tables in front of them was also different. There was fresh blood food, green plant combs, and even strange food that left one scratching one's head. Although these fellows came from different planes, with strange races and skin tones, without exception, they all emitted a powerful and terrifying aura. To be able to cross the sea of stars and appear here, one had to be at least a rank 4, and rank 5 and 6 creatures were not rare either. As long as they were willing to follow the tavern's rules, this place was open to everyone. The main reason why so many powerful beings of other races would obediently follow the human Magi's rules was that the owner of this tavern was a rank 7 great magus. This reason was more than enough. After the purple light entered the tavern, the energy barrier on the surface of her body dissipated, revealing the figure of a young female magus. She was bald, eyebrows free, purple eyes, and wore purple soft armor. Her figure and appearance were passable, but the expression on her face was a little too cold. Once she entered, she walked straight to the counter and casually tossed out 2 star diamonds, saying in a muffled voice, "A portion of devilfish meat, and prepare a room for me." The bartender standing behind the counter was as fat as a pig, and his mannerisms were extremely fitting of his status. He placed his fat and oily hand on the counter, and with a wave of his hand, the 2 star diamonds disappeared without a trace. "Hurry up and give Lady Gria the devilfish meat and prepare a good room. Annie, go and clean up personally. Don't let the last customer's belongings be left behind and disturb Lady Gria." The bartender Tom's rough voice immediately sounded in the tavern. The succubus Annie, who was the tavern's waitress, hurriedly swayed her slender waist and squeezed into a passage at the back. Roaming the sea of stars was not an easy task. The ever-present energy tides and void storms constantly consumed the strength and mind of powerful beings, and not many races could recover from the assault of the storm. Hence, rather than calling this tavern a gathering place, it was better to say that it was a well-protected place for powerful beings to rest and recover their strength. Very soon, a large plate of devilfish meat was served. Compared to the interior of the plane, the portion of this devilfish meat was undoubtedly too large. The size of this devilfish meat was already larger than Gria, and its appearance was extremely ugly and sinister. It was covered in dense bone spurs and a grayish-white carapace. Even a light tap on it with a knife would produce dazzling sparks. From this, one could see how tough and terrifying it was. This devilfish was actually a living creature. After being placed on the stone table, it was still angrily twisting its body, shooting sharp water arrows at all the living creatures around it. The water arrows whistled through the air, and the strength of the water arrows was actually at rank 2. Gria raised her finger and flicked it lightly. A purple ray shot out and pierced through the head of the devilfish meat, and a strange dark green brain juice flowed out. She immediately crouched over and sucked on the juice while clicking her tongue. The devilfish was a mutant hybrid between an astral beast and a plain creature. Regardless of whether it was the brain juice or flesh, all of them contained abundant magic energy. It was undoubtedly a good food for powerful beings to replenish their energy. Although its appearance did not conform to the aesthetic standards of human magi, and its flesh was too fishy. However, in the depths of the sea of stars where resources were hard to find, there were not many high-energy food with such high energy reserves at such a low price. Gria's status as a rank 4 magus might be considered top-notch in the magus world, but in this chaotic sea of stars, a rank 4 magus could barely survive. So, she had nothing to be picky about. Looking at Gria wolfing down the flesh of the devilfish, the bartender Tom came to her side and whispered mysteriously, "Lady Gria, there's news from the headquarters." Gria did not care about her image at all, and was still eating and drinking diligently. She glanced at the wretched Tom and frowned. "Don't they know that I'm chasing that soul beast? It took 17 years to find its trail. Why are they looking for me now?" Tom winked and snickered. "I heard that the idiots from the headquarters seem to have suffered a big loss. Even the black-robed Savorius was seriously injured and hid in his nest, not daring to come out. That's why Domnall is in a hurry to summon you back." Savorius was injured. Who? Who? Is there someone in the Magus world who dares to openly oppose the association? The news is very vague. It's only said that an elemental Magus suddenly appeared in the central continent. I heard that he's very powerful and even went to the association's headquarters to defeat Olivier. During this time, he's preparing to unify the central continent and is fighting there. Humph, that group of cowards in the central continent. Can there be a strong person among them? Gria said disdainfully. Let them fight first. When they're beaten to a pulp, my mission here will be almost completed. It won't be too late to go back then. Tom could not help but grin bitterly. But the orders from the headquarters are not like this. Domhnall is very urgent, and he wants you to return to the headquarters as soon as you receive the news. For what he said, if you return late, the central continent will be completely destroyed. She finally had some progress in her mission, but suddenly received such an order. Her face immediately turned gloomy. Why didn't you go to Amway, but came to me? Master Amway entered an ancient ruin, and it's estimated that he won't come out for at least a decade or two. So, Gria's face became more and more unsightly. Humph, then the loss of this old beast will be on Domhnall's head. See how I'll deal with this group of idiots who can't even protect their home. That you're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.